Shmee. Shmee, shmee. Oh my god. I pushed the button. For a moment there, I kind of forgot I hit the stream button. Yeah, hello. Hi, welcome here. Good morning. Wait, no, maybe good evening? I don't know. Hello, Adnormal. Hello, KTA. Going to sleep very shortly? Oh. Okay, well, I hope you have a good sleep in a moment. Team TM. Gonna be reading a book. I remember to have this bouncy little smid that bounces to the music. So I turned it back on. It's 6:20 a.m. How are y'all? I'm fine, I guess. I had 2 p.m. breakfast a little while ago. You know. Oh, that's right. Let me ping the little guy poll or whatever. Yeah. Do we need to have ham regime change here? Sure, why not? It's there to okay. You know, you gotta have some comedic relief or whatever. Okay. Maybe I should since it's been a few days since I read this, we'll take a look at the we're on page 54. See what the previous couple ones were. It was China, Italy, Greece, the Philippines. 40s and 60s and so. Okay. Albania, 1949 to 1953. A proper English spy. So, blah. Hold on, let me turn off all the filters on this guy. Oh wait, that's right. It doesn't work. Like, never mind. No, since I'm gonna be talking most of the time, this maid is just gonna be standing still. I'm just gonna hide him again. Send him away. Really messed up. To simultaneously plan and sabotage this ill-fated venture must have been a severe test of his energy and ingenuity, wrote one of Kim Philby's biographers. The venture was the clandestine attempt, begun in 1943 by the United States and Great Britain, to overthrow the pro-Soviet regime of Enver Hoxha through guerrilla-fomented uprisings. Hold on, let me add the rest of the title into the rest of the title into the title. Let's see. It ended in disaster, in part because the Russians had apparently been alerted by Philby, the proper Englishman who had gone to all the right schools and penetrated the highest ranks of British and American intelligence, though he had been a Soviet spy since the age of 21. Philby had moved to Washington the year before to act as the British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, liaison to the CIA. In that capacity, he served as a co-director of the CIA-SIS task force and engaged in planning the Albanian operation. The choice had fallen upon Albania because it was regarded as the most vulnerable of the socialist states, the smallest and the weakest, not sharing a border with the Soviet Union, isolated between a US-controlled Greece and a Yugoslavia that was a renegade from the Soviet bloc. Moreover, a recent agreement between the Soviet Union and Albania involved aid for Albania in return for a Soviet right to build a submarine base with direct access to the Mediterranean. By the rules and logic of the Cold War board game, this was a move the United States was obliged to thwart. The task force began by recruiting scattered Albanian immigrants who were living in Italy, Greece, and elsewhere. They were exposed to basic military training with a touch of guerrilla warfare thrown in at sites established on the British island of Malta in the Mediterranean, in the American occupation zone of West Germany, and to a lesser extent in England itself. Whenever we want to subvert any place, confided Frank Wisner, the CIA's head of covert operations, to Philby, we find that the British own an island within easy reach. Intermittently, for some 3.5 years, the immigrants were sent back into their homeland, slipping up into the mountains of Greece and over the border, parachuting in from planes which had taken off from bases in Western Europe, entering by sea from Italy. American planes and balloons dropped propaganda leaflets and goods as well, such items in scarce supply in Albania as flour, halva, Jalvah, type of confectionery. Okay. Thick paste made from flour, butter, oil, saffron, rose water, milk, turmeric powder, and sugar. It's like a little dense cake thing. Let's see. In scarce supply as flour, halva, needles, and razor blades, along with a note announcing that they were a gift from the Albanian National Liberation Front. Another instance of the subtle marketing touch that the CIA, born and raised in America, was to bring to so many of its operations. In outline, the plan, or the hope, was for the guerrillas to make for their old home regions and try to stir up anti-Soviet and anti-communist sentiments, eventually leading to uprisings. They were to distribute propaganda, obtain political, economic, and military information, engage in sabotage, recruit individuals into cells, and supply them with equipment. Later infusions of men and material would expand these cells into centers of resistance. Let me add one more. Cool. Whatever. I figured I should probably try to finish this book in a decent amount of time, since they're trying to do another regime change right now. Yeah. Cold War conventional wisdom dictated that the masses of Eastern Europe were waiting to be sparked into open rebellion for their freedom. Even if this were the case, the choice of ignition was highly dubious, for the guerrillas included amongst their numbers many who supported a reinstitution of the Albanian monarchy in the person of the reactionary King Zog, then in exile, and others who had collaborated with the Italian fascists or Nazis during their wartime occupations of Albania. To be sure, there were those of Republican and Democratic leanings in the various immigrant committees as well, but State Department papers, later declassified, reveal that prominent Albanian collaborators played leading roles in the formation of these committees. These were individuals the State Department characterized as having somewhat checkered political backgrounds who might sooner or later occasion embarrassment to this government. They were admitted to the United States over the department's objections because of intelligence considerations. TM. One of the checkered gentlemen was Zafar Deva, Minister of Interior during the Italian occupation, who had been responsible for deportations of Jews, communists, partisans, and suspicious persons, as a captured Nazi report put it, to extermination camps in Poland. In the name of the CIA-funded National Committee for a Free Albania, a powerful underground radio station began broadcasting inside the country, calling for the nation's liberation from the Soviet Union. In early 1951, several reports came out of Albania of open, organized resistance and uprisings. To what extent these happenings were a consequence of the Western infiltration and agitation is impossible to determine. Overall, the campaign had little to show for its efforts. It was hounded throughout by logistical foul-ups and the grim reality that the masses of Albanians greeted the immigrants as something less than liberators, either from fear of the harsh Hoxha regime or because they supported the social changes taking place more than they trusted what the immigrants had to offer. Let's see. Hoxha, was that the... Oh, okay, that's the current ruler. Hello, Ash. Welcome to... Hi, welcome to Ham Regime Change. Do I have... Let me go and grab a water bottle, actually. Ah, that's right. Let me open it over the... Gotta open these over the sink because they're filled up so much that if I open them in my hands, you know, I have to squeeze the water bottle a bit to get a grip, and then that pushes the water up out of it, and then it gets everywhere. I almost dropped it. Okay. Let's see. Worst of all, the Albanian authorities usually seemed to know in which area the guerrillas would be arriving and when. Kim Philby was not the only potential source of disclosure. The Albanian groups were almost certainly infiltrated, and careless talk indulged in by the Matsali immigrants could have contributed to the fiasco. Philby, referring to the CIA-SIS task force members' habit of poking fun at Albanians, wrote, "Even in our more serious moments, we Anglo-Saxons never forgot that our agents were just down from the trees." So lax was security that New York Times correspondent Cyrus I. Sulzberger filed several dispatches from the Mediterranean area touching upon the intervention, which required virtually no reading between the lines. The articles carried no attention-grabbing headlines. There was no public comment about them from Washington. No reporters asked government officials any embarrassing questions. Ergo, a non-event for Americans. Despite one failure after another, and without good reason to expect anything different in the future, the operation continued until the spring of 1953, resulting in the death or imprisonment of hundreds of men. It was not simply the obsession... Oh, figurative. Okay. It was not simply the obsession with chopping off one of Stalin's fingers. Figuratively. Professional prestige and careers had been invested. A visible success was needed to recoup past losses and justify earlier decisions. And the men who were being lost were, after all, only Albanians who spoke not a word of the Queen's English and did not yet walk upright properly. Speaking from their perspective of the CIA or whatever. There was, however, the danger of the action escalating into conflict with the Soviet Union. The Soviets did in fact send some new fighter planes to Albania, presumably in the hope that they could shoot down the foreign aircraft making drops. The operation could not fail to remind Stalin, Hoxha, and the entire socialist bloc of another Western intervention 30 years earlier in the Soviet Union. It could only serve to make them yet more paranoid about Western intentions and convince them to turn the screw of internal security yet tighter. Indeed, every now and again over the ensuing years, Hoxha mentioned the American and British invasion and used it to justify his policy of isolation. In the early 1960s, Hoxha himself did what the CIA and SIS had failed to do. He pulled Albania out of the Soviet orbit. The Albanian leader purged pro-Soviet officials in his government and aligned his country with China. There was no military retaliation on the part of the USSR. In the mid-1970s, Hoxha forsook China as well. And that was a short... Well, I guess a lot of these chapters are kind of short. Let's see. There's 7. Eastern Europe, 1948 to 1956. Operation Splinter Factor. Józef Światło surfaced at a press conference in Washington on 28th of September 1954. Światło was a Pole. He had been a very important one, high up in the Ministry of Public Security, the secret police. The story went that he had defected in West Berlin the previous December while on a shopping trip. And now the State Department was presenting him to the world to clear up the mystery of the Fields, the American citizens who had disappeared in 1949. Światło revealed that Noel Field and his wife Herta had been arrested in Hungary, and that brother Herman Field had suffered the same fate in Poland at the hands of Światło himself, all in connection with the trial of a leading Hungarian communist. The State Department had already dispatched strong letters to the governments of Hungary and Poland. There is a more expanded and more sinister version of the Józef Światło story. This story has Światło seeking to defect to the British in Warsaw back in 1948, at a time when he was already in his high security position. The British, for various reasons, turned his case over to the United States, and at the request of Alan Dulles, Światło was told to remain at his post until further notice. At this time, Dulles was not yet director of the CIA, but was a close consultant to the agency, had his own men in key positions, and was waiting only until November for Thomas Dewey to win the presidential election and appoint him to the top position. Harry Truman's surprising re-election postponed this for 4 years, but Dulles did become deputy director in 1951. Noel Field, formerly a State Department Foreign Service officer, was a long-time communist fellow traveler, if not a party member in the United States or Europe. During the Second World War, his path converged with Dulles's in intrigue-filled Switzerland. Dulles was an OSS man. That's the CIA prototype or whatever. Field, the representative of the Unitarian Church in Boston, helping refugees from Nazi occupation. Field made it a point particularly to help communist refugees, of which there were many inasmuch as communists were second only to Jews on the German persecution list. The OSS aided the operation financially. The communists, in turn, were an excellent source of information about happenings in Europe of interest to Washington and its allies. Toward the end of the war, Field induced Dulles to provide American support for a project. Hold on, maybe I should move the mic forward a little. It's a little bit close to me. Okay. So toward the end of the war, Field induced Dulles to provide American support for a project which placed agents in various European countries to prepare the way for the advancing Allied troops. The men chosen by Field, unsurprisingly, were all communists, and their placement in certain Eastern European countries helped them to get their hands on the reins of power long before non-communist forces were able to regroup and organize themselves. It could be concluded from this that Alan Dulles had been duped. Moreover, the OSS, under Dulles' direction, and again with Field involved, had financed the publication of a clandestine newspaper inside Germany. Anti-fascist and left-wing, the paper was called Neues Deutschland, and immediately upon liberation became the official newspaper of the East German Communist Party. After the war, these incidents served as jokes which intelligence services of both East and West could and did appreciate. Before long, the joke fell heavily upon Noel Field. In 1949, when Field visited Poland, he was regarded with grave suspicion by Polish authorities. He was seen to have worked during the war in a position which could easily have been a front for Western espionage, a position which... Oh, there's a loud noise outside. They're sawing. They're activating that chain or something. Gee. Let's see. The position which brought him into regular contact with senior Communist Party members, and he had, after all, worked closely with Alan Dulles, famous already as a spy master, and the brother of John Foster Dulles, prominent in Washington official circles, and already making his calls for the liberation of the Soviet bloc nations. At the time of Field's arrival in Poland, Józef Światło was looking to implicate Jakub Berman, a high party and state official whom Światło was suspicious of and detested. It was his failure to convince the Polish president to act against Berman that reportedly drove Światło to try to defect the year before. When when Noel Field wrote to Berman, asking his help in obtaining a job in Eastern Europe, Sviatlo learned of the letter and saw his chance to nail Berman. But first, Noel Field had to be established as an American spy. Given the circumstantial evidence pointing in that direction, that would not be too difficult for a man of Sviatlo's high position and low character. I'm not quite sure if this is specifically related to American intervention in another country, but whatever. We'll let him have this one, I guess. For a man of Sviatlo's high position and low character. Of course, if Field really was working with U.S. intelligence, Sviatlo couldn't very well be exposing him, since the Polish security officer was now himself an American agent. Accordingly, he sent his first message to the CIA, describing his plan about Berman and Field and the harm it could do to the Communist Party in Poland. He concluded with, "Any objections?" Alan Dulles had none. His reaction to Sviatlo's message was one of pleasure and amusement. The time had come to settle accounts with Noel Field. More importantly, Dulles saw that Sviatlo, using Noel Field, the American spy, as a bludgeon, could knock off countless leading communist officials in the Soviet bloc, could put the whole of the bloc into a state of acute paranoia, and set off a wave of repression and Stalinist tyranny that could eventually lead to uprisings. Dulles called his plan Operation Splinter Factor. Thus it was that Joseph Sviatlo was directed to find spies everywhere in Eastern Europe. He would uncover American plots and British plots, Trotskyist conspiracies, and Titoist conspiracies. Excuse me. He would report to Soviet secret police chief Lavrenti Beria himself that at the center of the vast network was a man named Noel Haviland Field. Field was arrested and wound up in a prison in Hungary, as did his wife Herta when she came looking for him. And when his brother Herman Field sought to track down the two of them, he met the same fate in Poland. Sviatlo was in a unique position to carry out Operation Splinter Factor. Not only did he have the authority and command, he had the files on countless Communist Party members in the bloc countries. Any connection they had had with Noel Field, anything that Field had done, could be interpreted to show the hand of American intelligence or an act of real or potential subversion of the socialist states. The Soviets and Stalin himself were extremely interested in the Fieldists. Noel Field had known almost everyone who was anyone in the Soviet bloc. Just in case the level of paranoia in the infant, insecure governments of Eastern Europe was not high enough, a CIA double agent would corroborate a vital piece of information, or introduce the right rumor at the right time, or the agency's Radio Free Europe would broadcast certain tantalizing, seemingly coded messages, or the CIA would direct the writing of letters from East European expatriates in the United States to leading communists in their homelands, containing just a bit of information, or the phrase, carefully designed to lift the eyebrows of a security officer. Many of the victims of Sviatlo's purges were people who had spent the war years in the West rather than in the Soviet Union, and thus had crossed Fields' path. These were people who tended to be more nationalist communists, who wanted to put greater distance between their countries and the Soviet Union, as Tito had done in Yugoslavia, and who favored a more liberal regime at home. Dulles brushed aside the argument that these were people to be supported, not eliminated. He felt that they were potentially the more dangerous to the West, because if their form of communism were allowed to gain a foothold in Eastern Europe, then communism might become respectable and accepted. Particularly with Italy and France threatening to vote communists into power, communism had to be shown at its worst. At its quote-unquote worst. There were hundreds of trials all over Eastern Europe, show trials and lesser spectacles, in which the name of Noel Field played an important part. What Operation Splinter Factor began soon took on a life of its own. Following the arrest of a highly placed person, others fell under suspicion because they knew him or had been appointed by him, or any other connection to an arrested person might serve to implicate some unlucky soul. Joseph Sviatlo had his counterpart in Czechoslovakia, a man firmly entrenched in the upper rungs of the Czech security apparatus. The man, whose name is not known, had been recruited by General Reinhard Gehlen, the former Nazi intelligence chief, who went to work for the CIA after the war. When, in October 1956, the uprising in Hungary occurred, these men, according to the CIA, were not used because they were not yet ready. but the agency did send its agents in Budapest into action to join the rebels and help organize them. In the meantime, RFE, Radio Free Europe, like Radio Free Asia, like CIA-funded bullshit-ass news. Okay. RFE was exhorting the Hungarian people to continue their resistance, offering tactical advice, and implying that American military assistance was on the way. It never came. There is no evidence that Operation Splinter Factor contributed to the Hungarian uprising or to the earlier ones in Poland and East Germany. Nonetheless, the CIA could point to all the Cold War anti-communist propaganda points it had won because of the witch hunts in the East, the human cost notwithstanding. See, Czechoslovakia was the worst case. By 1951, an unbelievable 169,000 card-carrying members of the Czech Communist Party had been arrested, 10% of the entire membership. There were tens of thousands more in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Bulgaria. Hundreds were put to death, others died in prison or went insane. After Sviatlo defected in December 1953, East European intelligence services came to realize that he had been working for the other side all along. 4 weeks after Sviatlo held his Washington press conference, the Polish government announced that it was releasing Herman Field because investigation had revealed that the charges which had been brought against him by an American agent and provocateur, Joseph Sviatlo, were baseless. Field was later paid $50,000 for his imprisonment, as well as having his convalescence at a sanatorium. Convalescence. Time spent recovering from an illness or mature medical treatment. Sanatorium. Historic name for the specialized hospital for the treatment of specific diseases. Okay. I could have just said hospital stay. Okay. 3 weeks after Herman Field's release, Noel and Herta Field were freed in Hungary. The government in Budapest stated that it could not justify the charges against them. They were also compensated and chose to remain in Hungary. Once Noel Field had been officially declared innocent, the cases of countless others in East Europe had to be reviewed. First in trickles, then in rushes. The prisoners were released. By 1956, the vast majority stood outside prison walls. Throughout the decade following the war, the CIA was fanning the flames of discontent in Eastern Europe, in many ways other than Operation Splinter Factor. Radio Free Europe, RFE, CF... Man, I can look shit up. What does CF stand for? What does it mean in a text? Literally means compare. That? No, that's not it. That's what it literally means, but not what it actually means. The abbreviation CF dot is used in writing to refer the reader to other materials that can make a comparison with the topic being discussed. Okay. Okay, they're saying compared to the chapter on the Soviet Union. Radio Free Europe, broadcasting from West Germany, never missed a dirty trick. In January 1952, for example, after RFE learned that Czechoslovakia was planning to devalue its currency, it warned the population, thus stimulating a nationwide buying panic. RFE's commentaries about various European communists were described by Blanche Wiesen-Cook in her study of the period that declassified Eisenhower. She wrote that the broadcasts involved a wide range of personal criticism, tawdry, and slanderous attacks ranging from rumors of brutality and torture to corruption and to madness, perversion, and vice. Everything was used that could be imagined in order to make communists, whether in England or in Poland, look silly, undignified, and insignificant. One of the voices heard frequently over RFE on the subject of communist obnoxiousness was none other than Joseph Sviatlo, who had earned the nickname of Butcher for his proclivity to torture. Needless to say, the born-again humanitarian made no mention of Splinter Factor or his double role, although some of his broadcasts reportedly shook up the Polish security system for the better. Anyway, the US could stir up trouble in new sense, supporting opposition groups in Romania, setting up an underground radio station in Bulgaria, dropping propaganda from balloons over Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. On one day in August 1951 alone, 11,000 balloons carrying 13 million leaflets, dropping people as well, 4 American airmen, presumably intelligence operatives, landing in Hungary. In 1955, Eastern Europeans could be found at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, training with the Green Berets, that's U.S. Army Special Forces, learning guerrilla warfare tactics, hopefully to be used in their native lands. By the following year, hundreds of Hungarians, Romanians, Poles, and others were being trained by CIA paramilitary specialists at a secret installation in West Germany. You know, grassroots uprising, TM. Oh, and ads back to play. Now we're on Deutschland. I mean Germany. Should I wait for this ad to play? Oh, that's right. I usually turn off ads during book reading streams. I forgot. Okay. Get that motherfucker. Hello, Mom. I found your gifts. Interesting name. Welcome to here. Hope you're having a good day today. Okay. Turned off the ads, which I totally forgot to do earlier. Right. Chapter 8. Germany, 1950s. Everything from juvenile delinquency to terrorism. Within a period of 30 years and 2 world wars with Germany, the Soviet Union suffered more than 40 million dead and wounded. Enormous devastation to its land, and its cities razed to the ground. At the close of the Second World War, the Russians were not kindly disposed toward the German people. With their own country to rebuild, they placed the reconstruction of Germany far down on their list of priorities. The United States emerged from the war with relatively minor casualties and its territory completely unscathed. It was ready, willing, and able to devote itself to its main priority in Europe, the building of an anti-communist bulwark in the West, particularly in the strategic location of Germany. In 1945, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson has written, official American policy was explicitly to bring home to the Germans that they could not escape the suffering they had brought upon themselves, and to control the German economy, to prevent any higher standard of living than in neighboring nations. From the outset, Acheson added, U.S. officials in Germany believed this plan to be unworkable. Acheson did not explain what lay behind this prognosis, but its correctness soon became apparent for 3 distinct reasons. Also I forgot to say hello. Hello, Bills. Hi, welcome here. See, its correctness soon became apparent for 3 distinct reasons. 1. Influential American business and financial leaders, some of them occupying important government positions, had too great a stake in a highly industrialized Germany, usually dating back to before the war, to allow the country to sink to the depths that some American policymakers advocated as punishment. 2. A revitalized West Germany was seen as an indispensable means of combating Soviet influence in the eastern sector of the country, if not in all of Eastern Europe. West Germany was to become the showcase of Western democracy, dramatic living proof of the superiority of capitalism over socialism. Oh, hi, thank you for the follow, Lil Gabi. Welcome to here. Welcome to Ham regime change. 3. In American conservative circles, and some liberal ones as well, wherein a Soviet invasion of Western Europe remained perpetually imminent, the idea of tying West Germany's industrial hands was one which came perilously close to being soft on communism, if not worse. Dwight Eisenhower echoed this last sentiment when he later wrote, had certain officials in the Roosevelt administration had their way, Germany would have been far worse off, for there were those who advocated the flooding of the Ruhr mines, the wrecking of German factories, and the reducing of Germany from an industrial to an agricultural nation. Among others, Harry Dexter White, later named by Attorney General Brownell as one who had been heavily involved in a Soviet espionage ring operating within our government, proposed exactly that. Thus it was that the deindustrialization of West Germany met the same fate as the demilitarization of the country would in the coming years, as the United States poured in massive economic assistance, $4 billion of Marshall Plan aid, and an army of industrial and technical experts. At the same time, the Soviet Union was pouring massive economic assistance out of East Germany. The Soviets dismantled and moved back home entire factories with large amounts of equipment and machinery, and thousands of miles of railroad track. When added to war reparations, the toll reached into the billions of dollars. By the early 1950s, though social services, employment, and cultural life in East Germany were on a par or superior to that in West Germany, the Western sector had the edge in those areas of prosperity with the most sex appeal. Salaries were higher, the eating was better, consumer goods more available, and the neon lights emblazoned the nights along the Kurfürstendamm. American Cold Warriors, however, as if discontent with the game score or with leaving so much to chance, instituted a crude campaign of sabotage and subversion against East Germany, designed to throw the economic and administrative machinery out of gear. The CIA and other U.S. intelligence and military services in West Germany, with occasional help from the likes of British intelligence and the West German police, recruited, equipped, trained, and financed German activist groups and individuals of West and East. Finding recruits for such a crusade was not difficult, for in post-war Germany, anti-communism lived on as the only respectable vestige of Nazism. The most active of these groups, which went by the name of Fighting Group Against Inhumanity, admitted that it had received financial support from the Ford Foundation and the West Berlin government. Subsequently, an East Berlin news magazine published a copy of a letter from the Ford Foundation confirming a grant of $150,000 to the National Committee for a Free Europe, so that it, in turn, could support the humanitarian activities of the Fighting Group Against Inhumanity. The National Committee for a Free Europe, in turn, was a CIA front organization which also ran Radio Free Europe. The Association of Political Refugees from the East, and the Investigating Committee of these vague humanitarian-ish sounding names they're throwing me. No, the Association of Political Refugees from the East and the Investigating Committee of Freedom-Minded Jurists of the Soviet Zone were two of the other groups involved in the campaign against East Germany. The actions carried out by these operatives ran the spectrum from juvenile delinquency to terrorism. Anything to make the commies look bad. It added up to the following remarkable record. Through explosives, arson, short-circuiting, and other methods, they damaged power stations, shipyards, a dam, canals, docks, public buildings, gas stations, shops, a radio station, outdoor stands, public transportation. Derailed freight trains, seriously injuring workers, burned 12 cars of a freight train, and destroyed air pressure hoses of others. Oh, they're so freedom-minded. They're freeing those trains. Blew up road and railway bridges, placed explosives on a railway bridge of the Berlin-Moscow line, but these were discovered in time. Hundreds would have been killed. Used special acids to damage vital factory machinery, put sand in the turbine of a factory, bringing it to a standstill, set fire to a towel-producing factory, promoted work slowdowns in factories, stole blueprints and samples of new technical developments. Killed 7,000 cows. Killed 7,000 cows of a cooperative dairy by poisoning the wax coating of the wire used to bale the cows as corn fodder. Oh, bale, like roll the bales out. Yeah. Added soap to powdered milk destined for East German schools. Yeah. Raided and wrecked left-wing offices in East and West Berlin, stole membership lists, assaulted and kidnapped leftists, and on occasion murdered them. Set off stink bombs to disrupt political meetings. Loaded balloons which burst in the air, scattering thousands of propaganda pamphlets down upon East Germans. Were in possession, when arrested, of a large quantity of the poison cantharidin, with which it was planned to produce poisoned cigarettes to kill leading East Germans. Had attempted to disrupt the World Youth Festival in East Berlin by sending out forged invitations, false promises of free bed and board, false notices of cancellations, carried out attacks on participants with explosives, firebombs, and tire puncturing equipment, set fire to a wooden bridge on a main motorway leading to the festival. Forged and distributed large quantities of food ration cards, for example, for 60,000 pounds of meat, to cause confusion, shortages, and resentment. sent out forged tax notices and other government directives and documents to foster disorganization and inefficiency within industry and unions. It gave considerable aid and comfort to East Germans who staged an uprising on 17th June 1953. During and after the uprising, the U.S. radio station in West Berlin, RIAS, Radio in the American Sector, issued inflammatory broadcasts into East Germany, appealing to the populace to resist the government. I'm just going to say RIAS. RIAS also broadcast warnings to witnesses in at least one East German criminal case being monitored by the Investigating Committee of Free-Minded Jurists of the Soviet Zone, that they would be added to the committee's files of accused persons if they lied. I used to have a hoodie that had like the text from the East Berlin, what was it? From the Berlin Wall signage that was like, "You're leaving the American sector." I decided to leave that sweater at home. I don't want it anymore. It was just like it wasn't even the official one from like the Wall Museum tourism shop or whatever. It was like a knockoff one from a nearby, slightly further away place. But like, whatever. Although many hundreds of the American agents were caught and tried by East Germany, the ease with which they could pass back and forth between the two sectors and infiltrate different enterprises without any language barrier provided opportunities for the CIA unmatched anywhere else in Eastern Europe. Throughout the 1950s, the East Germans and the Soviet Union repeatedly lodged complaints with the Soviets' erstwhile allies in the West and with the United Nations about specific sabotage and espionage activities, and called for the closure of the offices in West Germany they claimed were responsible, and for which they provided names and addresses. Inevitably, the East Germans began to tighten up entry into the country from the West. The West also bedeviled the East with a vigorous campaign of recruiting East German professionals and skilled workers. The brain drain. Eventually, this led to a severe labor and production crisis in the East, and in August 1961 to the building of the infamous Berlin Wall. While staging their commando attacks upon East Germany, American authorities and their German agents were apparently convinced that the Soviet Union had belligerent designs upon West Germany, perhaps a textbook case of projection. On 8th October 1952, the minister-president of the West German state of Hesse, Georg August Zinn, disclosed that the United States had created a secret civilian army in his state for the purpose of resisting a Russian invasion. This force of between 1,000 and 2,000 men belonged to the so-called Technical Service of the German Youth Federation, the latter characterized by the New York Times as a right-wing youth group frequently charged with extremist activities, a reference to the terrorist tactics described above. The stalwarts of the Technical Service were hardly youths, however, for almost all appeared to be between 35 and 50, and most, said Zinn, were former officers of the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, and the SS, Hitler's black shirts. For more than a year, they had received American training in infantry weapons and explosives, and political instruction in small groups at a secluded site in the countryside and at a U.S. military installation. The intelligence wing of the Technical Service, the state president revealed, had drawn up lists and card indexes of persons who were to be put out of the way when the Soviet tanks began to roll. These records, which contained detailed descriptions and intimate biographical information, were of some 200 leading Social Democrats. Is that back when Social Democrats just mean Let's see, we're of some 200 leading Social Democrats, including Zinn himself, 15 communists, and various others, all of whom were deemed politically untrustworthy and opponents of West German militarization. Apparently, support for peaceful coexistence and detente with the Soviet bloc was sufficient to qualify one for inclusion on the hit list, for one man was killed at the training site, charged with being an east-west bridge builder. It was this murder that led to the exposure of the entire operation. The United States admitted its role in the creation and training of the guerrilla army, but denied any involvement in the illegal, internal, and political activities of the organization. But Zinn reported that the Americans had learned of the plotting in May and had not actually dissolved the group until September, the same month that German security police arrested a number of the group's leaders. At some point, the American who directed the training courses, Sterling Garwood, had been supplied with carbon copies of the card index entries. It appears that at no time did U.S. authorities communicate anything of this matter to the West German government. As the affair turned out, those who had been attested were quickly released, and the United States thwarted any further investigation in this, the American zone of occupied Germany. Commented Herr Zinn, the only legal explanation for these releases can be that the people in Karlsruhe, the federal court, declared that they acted upon American direction. To add to the Führer, the national leader of the Social Democrats accused the United States of financing an opposition group to infiltrate and undermine his party. Erich Pollenhauer, whose name had also appeared on the technical services list, implied that American clandestine agencies were behind the plot despite the disapproval of high-ranking U.S. officials. The revelations about the secret army and its hit list resulted in a storm of ridicule and denunciation falling upon the United States from many quarters in West Germany. In particular, the delicious irony of the Americans working hand in glove with ex-Nazis did not escape the much castigated German people. Castigated. That's not castrated, it's castigated. Castigated. To reprimand someone severely. This operation in Germany, it was revealed many years later, was part of a much wider network called Operation Gladio, created by the CIA and other European intelligence services, with similar secret armies all over Western Europe. See Western Europe chapter. Okay. Iran, 1953. Making it safe for the King of Kings. So this is how we get rid of that madman Mossadegh, announced John Foster Dulles to a group of top Washington policymakers one day in June 1953. The Secretary of State held in his hand a plan of operation to overthrow the Prime Minister of Iran, prepared by Kermit Roosevelt of the CIA. There was scarcely any discussion amongst the high-powered men in the room. No probing questions, no legal or ethical issues raised. This was a grave decision to have made, Roosevelt later wrote. It involved tremendous risk. Surely it deserved thorough examination, thus closest consideration, somewhere at the very highest level. It had not received such thought at this meeting. In fact, I was morally certain that almost half of those present, if they had felt free or had the courage to speak, would have opposed the undertaking. Making shit up? No. Yeah, they're totally against it. Roosevelt, the grandson of Theodore and distant cousin of Franklin, was expressing surprise more than disappointment at glimpsing American foreign policy making undressed. The original initiative to oust Mossadegh had come from the British, for the elderly Iranian leader had spearheaded the parliamentary movement to nationalize the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, the sole oil company operating in Iran. In March 1951, the bill for nationalization was passed, and at the end of April, Mossadegh was elected prime minister by a large majority of parliament. On 1st of May, nationalization went into effect. The Iranian people, Mossadegh declared, were opening a hidden treasure upon which lies a dragon. As the prime minister had anticipated, the British did not take the nationalization gracefully, though it was supported unanimously by the Iranian parliament, by the overwhelming majority of the Iranian people for reasons of both economic justice and national pride. The Mossadegh government tried to do all the right things to placate the British. It offered to set aside 25% of the net profits of the oil operation as compensation. It guaranteed the safety and the jobs of the British employees. It was willing to sell its oil without disturbance to the tidy control system so dear to the hearts of the international oil giants. But the British would have none of it. What they wanted was the oil company back, and they wanted Mossadegh's head. A servant does not affront his lord with impunity. A military show of force by the British Navy was followed by a ruthless international economic blockade and boycott, and a freezing of Iranian assets which brought Iran's oil exports and foreign trade to a virtual standstill, plunged the already impoverished country into near destitution, and made payment of any compensation impossible. Nonetheless, and long after they had moved to oust Mossadegh, the British demanded compensation not only for the physical assets of the AIOC, but for the value of their enterprise in developing the oil fields. Excuse me. A request impossible to meet, and in the eyes of Iranian nationalists, something which decades of huge British profits had paid for many times over. The British attempt at economic strangulation of Iran could not have gotten off the ground without the active cooperation and support of the Truman and Eisenhower administrations and American oil companies. At the same time, the Truman administration argued with the British that Mossadegh's collapse could open the door to the proverbial communist takeover. When the British were later expelled from Iran, however, they had no alternative but to turn to the United States for assistance in toppling Mossadegh. In November 1952, the Churchill government approached Roosevelt, the de facto head of the CIA's Middle East division, who told the British that he felt that there was no chance to win approval from the outgoing administration of Truman and Atkinson. The new Republicans, however, might be quite different. John Foster Dulles was certainly different. The apocalyptic anti-communist saw in Mossadegh the epitome of all that he detested in the Third World: unequivocal neutralism in the Cold War, tolerance of communists, and disrespect for free enterprise, as demonstrated by the oil nationalization. Ironically, in recent years, Great Britain had nationalized several of its own basic industries, and the government was the majority owner of the AIOC. To the likes of John Foster Dulles, the eccentric Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh was indeed a madman, and when the Secretary of State considered further that Iran was a nation exceedingly rich in the liquid gold, and that it shared a border with the Soviet Union more than 1,000 miles long, he was not unduly plagued by indecision as to whether the Iranian Prime Minister should finally retire from public life, or perhaps living altogether. No. As matters turned out, the overthrow of Mossadegh in August 1953, which was much more an American operation than a British one. 26 years later, Kermit Roosevelt took the unusual step of writing a book about how he and the CIA carried out the operation. He called his book Counter Coup to press home the idea that the CIA coup was staged only to prevent a takeover of power by the Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh, closely backed by the Soviet Union. Roosevelt was thus arguing that Mossadegh had to be removed to prevent a communist takeover, whereas the Truman administration had felt that Mossadegh had to be kept in power to prevent one. It would be incorrect to state that Roosevelt offers little evidence to support his thesis of the communist danger. It would be more precise to say that he offers no evidence at all. Instead, the reader is subjected to mere assertions of the thesis, which are stated over and over, apparently in the belief that enough repetition will convince even the most skeptical. Thus, are we treated to variations on the theme, such as the following. The Soviet threat was indeed genuine, dangerous, and imminent. Mossadegh had formed an alliance with the Soviet Union to oust the Shah. The obvious threat of Russian takeover. The alliance between Mossadegh and the Russian-dominated Tudeh was taking on a threatening shape. Mossadegh's increasing dependence on the Soviet Union. The hand of the Tudeh, and behind them the Russians, is showing more openly every day. Russian backing of the Tudeh and Tudeh backing of Mossadegh became ever more obvious. The Soviet Union was ever more active in Iran. Their control over Tudeh leadership was growing stronger all the time. It was exercised often, and to our eyes, with deliberate ostentation. But none of this subversive and threatening activity was apparently ever open, obvious, or ostentatious enough to provide Roosevelt with a single example he could impart to a curious reader. In actuality, although the Tudeh party more or less faithfully followed the fluctuating Moscow line on Iran, the relation of the party to Mossadegh was much more complex than Roosevelt and other Cold War chroniclers have made it out to be. The Tudeh felt very ambiguous about the wealthy, eccentric, land-owning prime minister who, nonetheless, was standing up to imperialism. The national bourgeoisie of your own country? Yeah. Oh, I said the word. Yeah, okay. Dean Atkinson, Truman's Secretary of State, described Mossadegh as essentially a rich, reactionary, feudal-minded Persian, hardly your typical Communist Party fellow traveler. On occasion, the Tudeh had supported Mossadegh's policies. More often, it had attacked them bitterly, and in one instance, on 15th of July 1951, a Tudeh-sponsored demonstration was brutally suppressed by Mossadegh, resulting in some 100 deaths and 500 injured. The Iranian leader, moreover, had campaigned successfully against lingering Soviet occupation of northern Iran after World War II, and in October 1947 had led parliament in its rejection of a government proposal that a joint Irano-Soviet oil company be set up to exploit the oil of northern Iran. What indeed did Mossadegh have to gain by relinquishing any of his power to the Tudeh and or the Soviet Union? The idea that the Russians even desired the Tudeh to take power is no more than speculation. There was just as much evidence, or as little, to conclude that the Russians, once again, were more concerned about their relationship with Western governments than with the fate of a local communist party in a country outside the socialist bloc of Eastern Europe. A secret State Department intelligence report, dated 9th January 1953, in the closing days of the Truman administration, stated that Mossadegh had not sought any alliance with the Tudeh, and that the major opposition to the National Front, Mossadegh's governing coalition, arises from the vested interests on the one hand and the Tudeh party on the other. The Tudeh party had been declared illegal in 1949, and Mossadegh had not lifted that ban, although he allowed the party to operate openly, at least to some extent because of his democratic convictions, and had appointed some Tudeh sympathizers to government posts. Many of the Tudeh's objectives paralleled those espoused by the National Front, the State Department report observed, but an open Tudeh move for power would probably unite independents and non-communists of all political leanings, and would result in energetic efforts to destroy Tudeh by force. The National Front itself was a coalition of highly diverse political and religious elements, including right-wing anti-communists, held together by respect for Mossadegh's personal character and honesty, and by nationalistic sentiments, particularly in regard to the nationalization of oil. In 1979, when he was asked about this State Department report, Kermit Roosevelt replied, "Oh, I don't know, I forgot." He replied, "I don't know what to make of that." Roy Henderson, U.S. ambassador to Iran in 1953, thought that there was a serious danger that Mossadegh was going to, in effect, place Iran under Soviet domination. Though he was the principal moving force behind the coup, Roosevelt was now passing the buck, and to a man who, as we shall see in the Middle East chapter, was given to alarmist statements about communist takeovers. One can but wonder what Roosevelt, or anyone else, made of a statement by John Foster Dulles before a Senate committee in July 1953. When the operation to oust Mossadegh was already in process, the Secretary of State, the press reported, testified that there was no substantial evidence to indicate that Iran was cooperating with Russia. On the whole, he added, Muslim opposition to communism is predominant, although at times the Iranian government appears to rely for support on the Tudeh party, which is communistic. The young Shah of Iran had been relegated to little more than a passive role by Mossadegh in the Iranian political process. His power had been whittled away to the point where he was incapable of independent action, noted the State Department intelligence report. Mossadegh was pressing for control of the armed forces and more say over expenditures of the royal court, and the inexperienced and indecisive Shah, the King of Kings, was reluctant to openly oppose the Prime Minister because of the latter's popularity. The actual sequence of events instigated by Roosevelt, which culminated in the Shah's ascendancy, appears rather simple in hindsight, even naive, and owed not a little to luck. The first step was to reassure the Shah that Eisenhower and Churchill were behind him in his struggle for power with Mossadegh, and were willing to provide whatever military and political support he needed. Roosevelt did not actually know what Eisenhower felt, or even knew about the operation, and went so far as to fabricate a message from the president to the Shah, expressing his encouragement. At the same time, the Shah was persuaded to issue royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh as prime minister and replacing him with one Fazlullah Zahedi, a general who had been imprisoned during the war by the British for collaboration with the Nazis. Late in the night of 14th and 15th of August, The Shah's emissary delivered the royal decree to Mossadegh's home, which was guarded by troops. Not surprisingly, he was received very coolly and did not get in to see the prime minister. Instead, he was obliged to leave the decree with a servant, who signed a receipt for the piece of paper dismissing his master from power. Equally unsurprising, Mossadegh did not abdicate. The prime minister, who maintained that only parliament could dismiss him, delivered a radio broadcast the following morning in which he stated that the Shah, encouraged by foreign elements, had attempted a coup d'etat. Mossadegh then declared that he was, therefore, compelled to take full power unto himself. He denounced Zahedi as a traitor and sought to have him arrested, but the general had been hidden by Roosevelt's team. The Shah, fearing all was lost, fled with his queen to Rome via Baghdad, without so much as packing a suitcase. Undeterred, Roosevelt went ahead and directed the mimeographing of copies of the royal decrees for distribution to the public, and sent 2 of his Iranian agents to important military commanders to seek their support. It appears that this crucial matter was left to the last minute, almost as an afterthought. Indeed, one of the 2 Iranians had been recruited for the cause only the same day, and it was only he who succeeded in winning a commitment of military support from an Iranian colonel who had tanks and armored cars under his command. Beginning on 16th of August, a mass demonstration arranged by the National Front, supporting Mossadegh and attacking the Shah in the United States, took place in the capital city. Is that? Hold on. It's Tehran. Maybe that's an old spelling. Took place in the capital city, Tehran. Roosevelt characterizes the demonstrators simply as the Tudeh, with strong Russian encouragement, once again failing to offer any evidence to support his assertion. The New York Times referred to them as Tudeh partisans and nationalist extremists, the latter term being one which could have applied to individuals comprising a wide range of political leanings. Among the demonstrators, there were as well a number of individuals working for the CIA. According to Richard Cottam, an American academic and author reportedly in the employ of the agency in Tehran at this time, these agents were sent into the streets to act as if they were Tudeh. They were more than just provocateurs, they were shock troops, who acted as if they were Tudeh people, throwing rocks at mosques and priests, the purpose of which was to stamp the Tudeh, and by implication Mossadegh, as being anti-religion. Good old false flag bullshit. During the demonstrations, the Tudeh raised their familiar demand for the creation of a democratic republic. They appealed to Mossadegh to form a united front and to provide them with arms to defend against the coup, but the prime minister refused. Instead, on 18th of August, he ordered the police and army to put an end to the Tudeh demonstrations, which they did with considerable force. According to the accounts of Roosevelt and Ambassador Henderson, Mossadegh took this step as a result of a meeting with Henderson in which the ambassador complained of the extreme harassment being suffered by U.S. citizens at the hands of the Iranians. It is left unclear by both of the Americans how much of this harassment was real and how much manufactured by them for the occasion. In any event, Henderson told Mossadegh that unless it ceased, he would be obliged to order all Americans to leave Iran at once. Mossadegh, says Henderson, begged him not to do this, for an American evacuation would make it appear that his government was unable to control the country, although at the same time the Prime Minister was accusing the CIA of being behind the issuance of the royal decrees. The Tudeh newspaper at this time was demanding the expulsion of interventionist American diplomats. Yeah, expel them. Crunch. Whatever Mossadegh's motivation, his action was again in sharp contradiction to the idea that he was in alliance with the Tudeh, or that the party was in a position to grab the reins of power. Indeed, the Tudeh did not take to the streets again. The following day, 19th of August, Roosevelt's Iranian agents staged a parade through Tehran, with a fund of some $1 million having been established in a safe in the American embassy. The extremely competent professional organizers, as Roosevelt called them, had no difficulty in buying themselves a mob, probably using but a small fraction of the fund. The various accounts of the CIA role in Iran have the agency spending from $10,000 to $19 million to overthrow Mossadegh. The larger amounts are based on reports that the CIA engaged in heavy bribery of members of parliament and other influential Iranians to enlist their support against the prime minister. Soon, a line of people could be seen coming out of the ancient bazaar, led by circus and athletic performers to attract the public. Oh, this was the parade staged in Tehran. The marchers were waving banners shouting, "Long live the Shah." Along the edges of the procession, men were passing out Iranian currency adorned with a portrait of the Shah. The demonstrators gathered followers as they went, people joining and picking up the chants, undoubtedly for a myriad of political and personal reasons. The balance of psychology had swung against Mossadegh. Along the way, some marchers broke ranks to attack the offices of pro-Mossadegh newspapers and political parties, Tudeh, and government offices. Presently, a voice broke in over the radio in Tehran announcing that the Shah's instruction that Mossadegh be dismissed has been carried out. The new Prime Minister, Fazlollah Zahedi, is now in office, and His Imperial Majesty is on his way home. This was a lie, or a pre-truth, as Roosevelt suggested. Cooking up some pre-truths in the back office. Only then did he go to fetch Zahedi from his hiding place. On the way, he happened to run into the commander of the Air Force, who was among the marching throng. Roosevelt told the officer to get hold of a tank in which to carry Zahedi to Mossadegh's house in proper fashion. Kermit Roosevelt would have the reader to believe that at this point it was all over, but the shouting and the champagne he was soon to uncork. Mossadegh had fled, Zahedi had assumed power, the Shah had been notified to return, a dramatic, joyful, and peaceful triumph of popular will. Inexplicably, he neglects to mention that in the streets of Tehran and in front of Mossadegh's house that day, a 9-hour battle raged with soldiers loyal to Mossadegh on one side and those supporting Zahedi and the Shah on the other. Some 300 people were reported killed and hundreds more wounded before Mossadegh's defenders finally succumbed. Roosevelt also fails to mention any contribution of the British to the whole operation, which considerably irritated the men in MI6, the CIA's counterpart, who claimed that they, as well as AIOC staff, local businessmen, and other Iranians, had indeed played a role in the events, but they have been tight-lipped about what that role was precisely. The U.S. military mission in Iran also claimed a role in the action, as Major General George C. Stewart later testified before Congress. Now, when this crisis came on and the thing was about to collapse, we violated our normal criteria, and among the other things we did, we provided the Army immediately on an emergency basis blankets, boots, uniforms, electric generators, and medical supplies that permitted and created the atmosphere in which they could support the Shah. The guns that they had in their hands, the trucks that they rode in, the armored cars that they drove through the streets, and the radio communications that permitted their control were all furnished through the Military Defense Assistance Program. The latter part of the general statement would presumably apply to the other side as well. It is conceivable that the Tudeh could have turned the fortunes of the day against the royalists, wrote Kenneth Love, a New York Times reporter who was in Tehran during the crucial days of August, but for some reason they remained completely aloof from the conflict. My own conjecture is that the Tudeh were restrained by the Soviet embassy because the Kremlin, in the first post-Stalin year, was not willing to take on such consequences as might have resulted from the establishment of a communist-controlled regime in Tehran. Yeah. Love's views, contained in a paper he wrote in 1960, may well have been inspired by information received from the CIA. By his own admission, he was in close contact with the agency in Tehran and even aided them in their operation. Earlier in the year, the New York Times had noted that prevailing opinion among detached observers in Tehran was that Mossadegh is the most popular politician in the country. During a period of more than 40 years in public life, Mossadegh had acquired a reputation as an honest patriot. In July, the State Department Director of Iranian Affairs had testified that Mossadegh has such tremendous control over the masses of people that it would be very difficult to throw him out. A few days later, at least 100,000 people filled the streets of Tehran to express strong anti-US and anti-Shah sentiments. Though sponsored by the Tudeh, the turnout far exceeded any estimate of party adherents. But popularity and masses of the unarmed kind counted for little, for in the final analysis, what Tehran witnessed was a military showdown carried out on both sides by soldiers obediently following the orders of a handful of officers, some of whom were staking their careers and ambitions on choosing the winning side. Some had a more ideological commitment. The New York Times characterized the sudden reversal of Mossadegh's fortunes as nothing more than a mutiny against pro-Mossadegh officers by the lower ranks who revered the Shah, had brutally quelled the demonstrations the day before, but refused to do the same on 19th August and instead turned against their officers. What connection Roosevelt and his agents had with any of the pro-Shah officers beforehand is not clear. In an interview given at about the same time that he finished his book, Roosevelt stated that a number of pro-Shah officers were given refuge in the CIA compound adjoining the U.S. Embassy at the time the Shah fled to Rome. But inasmuch as Roosevelt mentions not a word of this rather important and interesting development in his book, it must be regarded as yet another of his assertions to be approached with caution. In any event, it may be that the 19th of August demonstration, organized by Roosevelt's team, was just the encouragement and spark these officers were waiting for. Yet, if so, it further illustrates how much Roosevelt had left to chance. In light of all the questionable, contradictory, and devious statements which emanated at times from John Foster Dulles, Kermit Roosevelt, Loy Henderson, and other American officials, what conclusions can be drawn about American motivation in the toppling of Mossadegh? The consequences of the coup may offer the best guide. For the next 25 years, the Shah of Iran stood fast as the United States' closest ally in the Third World, to a degree that would have shocked the independent and neutral Mossadegh. The Shah literally placed his country at the disposal of U.S. military and intelligence organizations to be used as a Cold War weapon, a window and a door to the Soviet Union. Electronic listening and radar posts were set up near the Soviet border. American aircraft used Iran as a base to launch surveillance flights over the Soviet Union. Espionage agents were infiltrated across the border. Various American military installations dotted the Iranian landscape. Iran was viewed as a vital link in the chain being forged by the United States to contain the Soviet Union. In a telegram to the British acting Foreign Secretary in September, Dulles said, "I think if we can, in coordination, move quickly and effectively in Iran, we would close the most dangerous gap in the line from Europe to South Asia." In February 1955, Iran became a member. In February 1955, Iran became a member of the Baghdad Pact, set up by the United States, in Dulles' words, to create a solid band of resistance against the Soviet Union. Oh, hello, Geo. Hello, Geo. Welcome to here. Sorry. Oh, I got stuck in yeehaw voice. Thanks for the water and stretch and head pats. Okay. I'm still stretching, but I'm going to activate reading mode. 1 year after the coup, the Iranian government completed a contract with an international consortium of oil companies. Excuse me. Amongst Iran's new foreign partners, the British lost the exclusive rights they had enjoyed previously, being reduced now to 40%. Another 40% now went to American oil firms, the remainder to other countries. The British, however, received an extremely generous compensation for their former property. In 1958, Kermit Roosevelt left the CIA and presently went to work for Gulf Oil Co., one of the American oil firms in the consortium. Damn, it's so easy to go from the CIA to an oil firm to the CIA. That's really messed up. It's almost like they're not the same thing. But they're whatever. In this position, Roosevelt was director of Gulf's relations with the U.S. government and foreign governments, and had occasion to deal with the Shah. In 1960, Gulf Oil Co. Gulf appointed him a vice president. Subsequently, Roosevelt formed a consulting firm, Downs and Roosevelt, which between 1967 and 1970 reportedly received $116,000 a year above expenses for its efforts on behalf of the Iranian government. Another client, the Northrop Corporation, a Los Angeles-based aerospace company, like Northrop Grumman, paid Roosevelt $75,000 a year to aid in its sales to Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. See the Middle East chapter for Roosevelt's CIA connection with King Saud of Saudi Arabia. Another American member of the new consortium was Standard Oil Co. of New Jersey, now Exxon, a client of Sullivan and Cromwell, the New York law firm of which John Foster Dulles had long been the senior member. Brother Allen, director of the CIA, had also been a member of the firm. Syndicated columnist Jack Anderson reported some years later that the Rockefeller family, who controlled Standard Oil and Chase Manhattan Bank, had helped arrange the CIA coup that brought down Mossadegh. Chase Manhattan Bank helped bring down Iran's leader. That's really messed up. No, not exactly, but close enough. Anderson listed a number of ways in which the Shah demonstrated his gratitude to the Rockefellers, including heavy deposits of his personal fortune in Chase Manhattan and housing developments in Iran built by a Rockefeller family company. The standard textbook account of what took place in Iran in 1953 is that whatever else one might say for or against the operation, the United States saved Iran from a Soviet/communist takeover. Yet, during the 2 years of American and British subversion of a bordering country, the Soviet Union did nothing that would support such a premise. When the British Navy staged the largest concentration of its forces since World War II in Iranian waters, the Soviets took no belligerent steps. Nor when Great Britain instituted draconian international sanctions which left Iran in a deep economic crisis and extremely vulnerable, did the oil fields fall hostage to the Bolshevik menace. This, despite the whole of the Tudeh party at its disposal as agents, as Roosevelt put it. Not even in the face of the coup, with its imprint of foreign hands, did Moscow make a threatening move. Neither did Mossadegh at any point ask for Russian help. 1 year later, however, the New York Times would spew some shit, as they do. And the New York Times... Okay, 1 year later, however, the New York Times would editorialize that Moscow counted its chickens before they were hatched and thought that Iran would be the next people's democracy. At the same time, the newspaper warned with surprising arrogance that underdeveloped countries with rich resources now have an object lesson in the heavy cost that must be paid by one of their number, which goes berserk with fanatical nationalism. A decade later, Allen Dulles solemnly stated that communism had achieved control of the governmental apparatus in Iran. And a decade after that, Fortune magazine, to cite one of many examples, kept the story alive by writing that Mossadegh plotted with the Communist Party of Iran, the Tudeh, to overthrow Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and hook up with the Soviet Union. And what of the Iranian people? What did being saved from communism do for them? For the preponderance of the population, life under the Shah was a grim tableau of grinding poverty, police terror, and torture. Thousands were executed in the name of fighting communism. Dissent was crushed from the outset of the new regime with American assistance. Kenneth Love wrote that he believed that CIA officer George Carroll, whom he knew personally, worked with General Farhat Dadstan, the new military governor of Tehran, on preparations for the very efficient smothering of a potentially dangerous dissident movement emanating from the Bazaar area and the Tudeh in the first 2 weeks of November 1953. The notorious Iranian secret police, Savak, created under the guidance of the CIA and Israel, spread its tentacles all over the world to punish Iranian dissidents. According to a former CIA analyst on Iran, Savak was instructed in torture techniques by the agency. Amnesty International summed up the situation in 1976 by noting that Iran had the highest rate of death penalties in the world, no valid system of civilian courts, and a history of torture which is beyond belief. No country in the world has a worse record in human rights than Iran. When to this is added a level of corruption that startled even the most hardened observers of Middle Eastern thievery, it is understandable that the Shah needed his huge military and police force, maintained by unusually large U.S. aid and training programs, to keep the lid down for as long as he did. Said Senator Hubert Humphrey, apparently with some surprise, "Do you know what the head of the Iranian army told one of our people? He said the army was in good shape. Thanks to U.S. aid, it was now capable of coping with the civilian population. That army isn't going to fight the Russians. It's planning to fight the Iranian people. We have senators who know what's going on, then we have senators who don't know what's going on. Also, hello, Evos. Evos Fangs, welcome here. Yeah, I hope you're doing good day. Doing good today. I'm reading too many words and I trip on my words. Thanks for the water. Where force might fail, the CIA turned to its most... Where force might fail, the CIA turned to its most trusted weapon, money. To ensure support for the Shah, or at least the absence of dissent, the agency began making payments to Iranian religious leaders, always a capricious bunch. Payments to the Ayatollahs and Mullahs began in 1953 and continued regularly until 1977, when President Carter abruptly halted them. One informed intelligence source estimated that the amount paid reached as much as $400 million a year. Others thought that figure too high, which it certainly seems to be. The cutoff of funds to the holy man, it is believed, was one of the elements which precipitated the beginning of the end for the King of Kings. Caps locking. Oh yeah, I was gonna get up and do something. I don't remember what it was. Well, I guess. Oh, this wasn't that important anyway. Let me just... Okay, well, I still don't remember what exactly it was that I wanted to do, but... Yeah. Me remember. I grab your thing. Put it in my mouth. Little candies that I forgot about. I should probably not. Maybe I'll save them for later, though, actually. It's gonna make me start... It's gonna slow down my reading, because it's a live production, TMTM. Okay. Number 10. Guatemala, 1953 to 54. While the world watched. To whom do you turn for help when the police are assaulting you? The old question. Oh. I used to live with a boomer white woman who was living in Iran in the 60s because her naval officer dad was stationed there in the 60s and would constantly tell me things were good when the Shah was in power. Yikers. Yeah, maybe good for this boomer white woman. Or snaps. Kef. Let's see. To whom do you turn for help when the police are assaulting you? The old question. To whom does a poor banana republic turn when the CIA army is advancing upon its territory and CIA planes are overhead bombing the country? The leaders of Guatemala tried everyone. The United Nations, the Organization of American States, other countries individually, the world press, even the United States itself, in the desperate hope that it was all a big misunderstanding. that in the end, reason would prevail. Nothing helped. Dwight Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, and Allen Dulles had decided that the legally elected government of Jacobo Arbenz was communist, therefore it must go, and go it did in June 1954. She lived in a mansion. Oh, we gotta blow her up. She lived in a mansion and had indentured servants living there, and acted like it was a sad happenstance that the U.S. did not in fact cause. Fun? That's the name of that emote? Okay. Yeah, that's, yeah, and all the bad things in the world that the United States, for some reason, happens to have had some hand in, it's just happenstance. It was just bad already, and then the U.S. showed up to fix things, yeah. Kev. Let's see. Go it did in 1954. In the midst of the American preparation to overthrow the government, the Guatemalan foreign minister, Guillermo Torriero, lamented that the United States was categorizing as communism every manifestation of nationalism or economic independence, any desire for social progress, any intellectual curiosity, and any interest in progressive liberal reforms. Torriero was close to the truth, but Washington officials retained enough contact with reality and world opinion to be aware of the inappropriateness of coming out Washington officials retained enough contact with reality and world opinion to be aware of the inappropriateness of coming out against nationalism, independence, or reform. Thus it was that Secretary of State Dulles asserted that Guatemalans were living under a communist type of terrorism. President Eisenhower warned about the communist dictatorship establishing an outpost on this continent to the detriment of all the American nations. The U.S. ambassador to Guatemala, John Pt2, declared that we cannot permit a Soviet republic to be established between Texas and the Panama Canal. Others warned that Guatemala could become a base from which the Soviet Union might actually seize the canal. Senator Margaret Chase Smith hinted unmistakably that the unjustified increases in the price of coffee imported from Guatemala were due to communist control of the country, and called for an investigation. Damn, she got so mad about expensive coffee that she's like, they must be communists. We have to destroy them. And then when the coffee price goes down, finally things are good again. Sorry, that last one just... And so it went. The Soviet Union could be excused if it was somewhat bewildered by all the rhetoric, for the Russians had scant interest in Guatemala, did not provide the country with any kind of military assistance, did not even maintain diplomatic relations with it, thus did not have the normally indispensable embassy from which to conduct such nefarious schemes. During this period, the height of McCarthyist logic, there were undoubtedly those Americans who reasoned, all the better to deceive us. Yeehaw. With the exception of one occasion, the countries of Eastern Europe had as little to do with Guatemala as did the Soviet Union. A month before the coup, that is, long after Washington had begun preparation for it, Czechoslovakia made a single arms sale to Guatemala for cash, something the Czechs would no doubt have done for any other country willing to pay the price. The weapons, it turned out, were, in the words of the New York Times, worthless military junk. Time magazine poo-pooed the newspaper's report and cited U.S. military men giving a better appraisal of the weapons. It may be that neither Time nor the military men could conceive that one member of the international communist conspiracy could do such a thing to another member. The American propaganda mill made much of this arms transaction. Less publicized was the fact that Guatemala had to seek arms from Czechoslovakia because the United States had refused to sell it any since 1948 due to its reformist governments, and had pressured other countries to do the same despite Arbenz's repeated pleas to lift the embargo. Like the Soviets, Arbenz had reason to wonder about the American charges. The Guatemalan president, who took office in March 1951 after being elected by a wide margin, had no special contact or spiritual/ideological ties with the Soviet Union or the rest of the communist bloc. Although American policymakers and the American press, explicitly and implicitly, often labeled Arbenz a communist, there were those in Washington who knew better, at least during their more dispassionate moments. Under Arbenz's administration, Guatemala had voted at the United Nations so closely with the United States on issues of Soviet imperialism that a State Department group occupied with planning Arbenz's overthrow concluded that propaganda concerning Guatemala's UN record would not be particularly helpful in our case. And a State Department analysis paper reported that the Guatemalan president had support not only from communist-led labor and the radical fringe of professional and intellectual groups, but also among many anti-communist nationalists in urban areas. Nonetheless, Washington repeatedly and adamantly expressed its displeasure about the presence of communists working in the Guatemalan government and their active participation in the nation's political life. Arbenz maintained that this was no more than proper in a democracy, while Washington continued to insist that Arbenz was too tolerant of such people, not because of anything they had done, which was intrinsically threatening or offensive to the US or Western civilization, but simply because they were of the species communist, well known for its infinite capacity for treachery. Ambassador Perefoy, a diplomat whose suit might have been pinstriped, but whose soul was a loud Czech, warned Arbenz that U.S.-Guatemalan relations would remain strained so long as a single communist remained on the public payroll. The centerpiece of Arbenz's program was land reform. The need for it was clearly expressed in the all too familiar underdeveloped country statistics. In a nation overwhelmingly rural, 2.2% of the landowners owned 70% of the arable land. The annual per capita income of agricultural workers was $87. $87 a year. Yeah. Before the revolution of 1944, which overthrew the Ubico dictatorship, farm laborers had been roped together by the army for delivery to the lowland farms where they were kept in debt slavery by the landowners. The expropriation of large tracts of uncultivated acreage, which was distributed to approximately 100,000 landless peasants, the improvement in union rights for the workers, and other social reforms were the reasons Arbenz had won the support of communists and other leftists, which was no more than to be expected. When Arbenz was criticized for accepting communist support, he challenged his critics to prove their good faith by backing his reforms themselves. They failed to do so, thus revealing where the basis of their criticism lay. The party formed by the Communists, the Guatemalan Labor Party, held 4 seats in Congress, the smallest component of Arbenz's ruling coalition, which commanded a total of 51 seats in the 1953 to 54 legislature. Communists held several important sub-cabinet posts, but none was ever appointed to the cabinet. In addition, there were communists employed in the bureaucracy, particularly in the administration of land reform. Lacking anything of substance that could accuse the Guatemalan left, though, Washington officials were reduced to condemnation by semantics. Thus, communists, unlike normal human beings, did not take jobs in the government. They infiltrated the government. Communists did not support a particular program. They exploited it. Communists did not back Arbenz. They used him. Moreover, communists controlled the labor movement and land reform. But what type of person is it who devotes himself in an underdeveloped country to furthering the welfare of workers and peasants? None other than the type that Washington calls communist. The basic idea behind the employment of such language, which was standard Western fare throughout the Cold War, was to deny the idea that communists could be people sincerely concerned about social change. American officials denied it to each other as well as to the world. Here, for example, is an excerpt from a CIA report about Guatemala, prepared in 1952 for the edification of the White House and the intelligence community. Okay, I remembered what I was going to do earlier. I'm going to be like that. I thought nose itching would stop after I wasn't sick anymore, but well, I guess that's not quite as itchy, but it's still interrupting my reading. Okay. An excerpt from a CIA report about Guatemala. Communist political success derives in general from the ability of individual communists and fellow travelers to identify themselves with the nationalist, and social aspirations of the revolution of 1944. In this manner, they have been successful in infiltrating the administration and pro-administration political parties and have gained control of organized labor. Arbenz is essentially an opportunist whose politics are largely a matter of historical accident. The extension of communist influence has been facilitated by the applicability of Marxist cliches to the anti-colonial and social aims of the Guatemalan Revolution. The first plan to topple Arbenz was a CIA operation approved by President Truman in 1952, but at the 11th hour, Secretary of State Dean Acheson persuaded Truman to abort it. However, soon after Eisenhower became president in January 1953, the plan was resurrected. Both administrations were pressured by executives of United Fruit Company, much of whose vast and uncultivated land in Guatemala had been expropriated by the Arbenz government as part of the land reform program. The company wanted nearly $16 million for the land. The government was offering $525,000, United Fruit's own declared valuation for tax purposes. United Fruit functioned in Guatemala as a state within a state. It owned the country's telephone and telegraph facilities, administered its only important Atlantic harbor, and monopolized its banana exports. A subsidiary of the company owned nearly every mile of railroad track in the country. That fruit company's influence amongst Washington's power elite was equally impressive. On a business and or personal level, it had close ties to the Dulles brothers, various State Department officials, congressmen, the American ambassador to the United Nations, and others. Ann Whitman, the wife of the company's public relations director, was President Eisenhower's personal secretary. Under Secretary of State, and formerly director of the CIA, Walter Bedell Smith was seeking an executive position with United Fruit at the same time he was helping to plan the coup. He was later named to the company's board of directors. Under Arbenz, Guatemala constructed an Atlantic port and a highway to compete with United Fruits' holdings, and built a hydroelectric plant to offer cheaper energy than the US-controlled electricity monopoly. Arbenz's strategy was to limit the power of foreign companies through direct competition rather than through nationalization. Policy not feasible, of course, when it came to a fixed quantity like land. In his inaugural address, Arbenz stated that foreign capital will always be welcome as long as it adjusts to local conditions, remains always subordinate to Guatemalan laws, cooperates with the economic development of the country, and strictly abstains from intervening in the nation's social and political life. This hardly described United Fruit's role in Guatemala. Amongst much else, the company had persistently endeavored to frustrate Arbenz's reform programs, discredit him and his government, and induce his downfall. Arbenz was, accordingly, wary of multinationals and could not be said to welcome them into his country with open arms. This attitude, his expropriation of United Fruit's land, and his tolerance of communists were more than enough to make him a marked man in Washington. The United States saw these policies as being interrelated. That is, it was communist influence, not any economic or social exigency of Guatemalan life. which was responsible for the government's treatment of American firms. In March 1953, the CIA approached disgruntled right-wing officers in the Guatemalan army and arranged to send them arms. United Fruit donated $64,000 in cash. The following month, uprisings broke out in several towns, but were quickly put down by loyal troops. Excuse me. The rebels were put on trial and revealed the fruit company's role in the plot, but not the CIA's. The Eisenhower administration resolved to do the job right the next time around. With cynical glee, almost an entire year was spent in painstaking, step-by-step preparation for the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Of the major CIA undertakings, few have been as well documented as has the coup in Guatemala. With the release of many formerly classified government papers, the following story has emerged. Headquarters for the operation were established in Opa-locka, Florida, on the outskirts of Miami. The Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza lent/leased his country out as a site for an airstrip and for hundreds of men, Guatemalan exiles, and U.S. and Central American mercenaries to receive training in the use of weapons and radio broadcasting, as well as in the fine arts of sabotage and demolition. 30 airplanes were assigned for use in the Liberation, stationed in Nicaragua, Honduras, and the Canal Zone, to be flown by American pilots. The Canal Zone was set aside as a weapons depot from which arms were gradually distributed to the rebels, who were to assemble in Honduras under the command of Colonel Carlos Castillo Amas before crossing into Guatemala. Soviet-marked weapons were also gathered for the purpose of planting them inside Guatemala before the invasion to reinforce U.S. charges of Russian intervention. And, as important as arms it turned out, hidden radio transmitters were placed in and around the perimeter of Guatemala, including one in the U.S. Embassy. An attempt was made to blow up the trains carrying the Czech weapons from Portside to Guatemala City. However, a torrential downpour rendered the detonators useless, whereupon the CIA paramilitary squad opened fire on one train, killing a Guatemalan soldier and wounding 3 others, but the convoy of trains made it safely to its destination. After the Czech ship had arrived in Guatemala, Eisenhower ordered the stopping of suspicious foreign flag vessels on the high seas off Guatemala to examine cargo. The State Department's legal advisor wrote a brief which concluded in no uncertain terms that such action would constitute a violation of international law. Yeah, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? No matter. At least 2 foreign vessels were stopped and searched, one French and one Dutch. It was because of such actions by the British that the United States had fought the War of 1812. The Guatemalan military came in for special attention. My favorite reader tuber. Oh, hello, Barry. That's familiar indeed, you know. Hope you're doing good today. I have infinite itchy nose, apparently. Washington implanted a device inside my nose to try and slow down my readings. Okay. The Guatemalan military came in for special attention. The U.S. ostentatiously signed mutual security treaties with Honduras and Nicaragua, both countries hostile to Arbenz, and dispatched large shipments of arms to them in the hope that this would signal a clear enough threat to the Guatemalan military to persuade it to withdraw its support of Arbenz. Additionally, the U.S. Navy dispatched 2 submarines from Key West, saying only that they were going south. Several days later, the Air Force, amid considerable fanfare, sent 3 B-36 bombers on a courtesy call to Nicaragua. The CIA also made a close study of the records of members of the Guatemalan Officer Corps and offered bribes to some of them. One of the agency's clandestine radio stations broadcast appeals aimed at military men as well as others to join the liberation movement. The station reported that Arbenz was secretly planning to disband or disarm the armed forces and replace it with a people's militia. CIA planes dropped leaflets over Guatemala carrying the same message. Eventually, at Ambassador Purifoy's urging, a group of high-ranking officers called on Arbenz to ask that he dismiss all communists who held posts in his administration. The president assured them that the communists did not represent a danger, that they did not run the government, and that it would be undemocratic to dismiss them. At a second meeting, the officers also demanded that Arbenz reject the creation of the People's Militia. Oh, the demons are outside screaming once more. Why the fuck do they... You think they'll still be like that when they're 30? Slash J. Last time I heard screeching, I looked outside and they were just playing. They weren't even getting an ass whooped by their mom or whatever. Or being left outside of a locked door or shit. Okay. Reject the creation of the People's Militia. At one point, the CIA offered Arbenz himself a large sum of money, which was rejected. The money, which was deposited in a Swiss bank, presumably was offered to induce Arbenz to abdicate or to serve as a means of later claiming he was corrupt. On the economic front, contingency plans were made for such things as cutting off Guatemalan credit abroad, disrupting its oil supplies, and causing a run on its foreign reserves. But it was on the propaganda front that American ingenuity shone at its brightest, inasmuch as the Guatemalan government was being overthrown because it was communist. The fact of its communism would have to be impressed upon the rest of Latin America. Accordingly, the U.S. Information Agency, USIA, UCIA, began to place unattributed articles in foreign newspapers, labeling particular Guatemalan officials as communist and referring to various actions by the Guatemalan government as communist-inspired. In the few weeks prior to Arbenz's fall alone, more than 200 articles about Guatemala were written and placed in scores of Latin American newspapers. New Miku button? Yeah, it's totally related to our reading, actually. No. Maybe I'll change the description to be more obvious what it is. But if you look at the little icon, you might be able to see the American flag behind Miku, and it's that little snippet where she says the words.
Death to America!
Yeah. Let's see. Might need to... I don't know if I can actually adjust the volume on it. I hope it's not too loud or anything. Let's see. Placed in scores of Latin American newspapers. Employing a method which was to become a standard CIA/UCF feature all over Latin America and elsewhere. As we shall see, articles placed in one country were picked up by newspapers in other countries, either as a result of CIA payment or unwittingly because the story was of interest. Besides the obvious advantage of multiplying the potential audience, the tactic gave the appearance that independent world opinion was taking a certain stand, and further obscured the American connection. Yeah, it was so crazy when Hatsune Miku from Fortnite said death to America. That was like, wow. So Fortnite pilled. The UCIA also distributed more than 100,000 copies of a pamphlet entitled Chronology of Communism in Guatemala throughout the hemisphere, as well as 27,000 copies of anti-communist cartoons and posters. The American Propaganda Agency, moreover, produced 3 films on Guatemala with predictable content and newsreels favorable to the United States for showing free in cinemas. Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York, a prelate possessed of anti-communism, a man who feared social change more than he feared God, was visited by the CIA. He wasn't visited by God, he was visited by the CIA. Would His Reverence arrange CIA contact with Archbishop Mariano Rosso Arellano of Guatemala? The Cardinal would be delighted. Thus it came to pass that on 9th April 1954, a pastoral letter was read in Guatemalan Catholic churches, calling to the attention of the congregations that the presence in the country of a devil called communism, and demanding that the people rise as a single man against this enemy of God and country, or at least not rally in Arbenz's defense. To appreciate the value of this, one must remember that Guatemala's peasant class was not only highly religious, but that very few of them were able to read, and so could receive the Lord's word only in this manner. For those who could read, many thousands of pamphlets carrying the Archbishop's message were airdropped around the country. In May, the CIA covertly sponsored a Congress against Soviet intervention in Latin America in Mexico City. Same month, Somoza called in the diplomatic corps in Nicaragua and told them, his voice shaking with anger, that his police had discovered a secret Soviet shipment of arms, which had been planted by the CIA, near the Pacific coast, and suggested that the communists wanted to convert Nicaragua into a new Korean situation. A few weeks later, an unmarked plane parachuted arms with Soviet markings onto Guatemala's coast. On such fare did the people of Latin America dine for decades. By such tactics were they educated about communism. In late January 1954, the operation appeared to have suffered a serious setback when photostat copies of liberation documents found their way into Arbenza's hands. A few days later, Guatemala's newspapers published copies of correspondence signed by Castillo, Anas, Somoza, and others under banner headlines. The documents revealed the existence of some of the staging, training, and invasion plans, involving, amongst others, the government of the North. The State Department labeled the accusations of a U.S. role ridiculous and untrue, and said it would not comment further because it did not wish to give them a dignity they did not deserve. Said a department spokesperson, "It is the policy of the United States not to interfere in the internal affairs of other nations. This policy has repeatedly been reaffirmed under the present administration." Time magazine gave no credence whatsoever to the possibility of American involvement in such a plot, concluding that the whole expose had been masterminded in Moscow. The New York Times was not so openly cynical, but its story gave no indication that there might be any truth to the matter. Sorry, I had to sneeze. I was holding in the cheese. What? That's so fucking funny. Oh, you mean the not to interfere in other nations? Yeah. Yeah, it sure do be like that. Let's see. Story gave no indication that there might be any truth to the matter. Latin American observers in New York, reported the newspaper, said the plot charges savored of communist influence. This article was followed immediately on the page by one headed, "Red Labor Chiefs Meet. Guatemalan Confederation opens its Congress." And the CIA continued with its preparations as if nothing had happened. Good old New York Times. I mean, good old U.S. media being just an... Oh, but they're not like a, they're not like a state outlet. They're totally independent. They just tell it as it is. The New York Times is Chomsky's favorite newspaper. Excuse me. Okay. The offensive began in earnest on 18th June with planes dropping leaflets over Guatemala, demanding that Arbenz resign immediately or else various sites would be bombed. CIA radio stations broadcast similar messages. That afternoon, the planes returned to machine gun houses near military barracks. Oh, okay, I see. That afternoon, the planes returned to machine gun houses near military barracks, dropped fragmentation bombs, and strafed the National Palace. Over the following week, the air attacks continued daily, strafing or bombing ports, fuel tanks, ammunition dumps, military barracks, the international airport, a school, and several cities. 9 persons, including a 3-year-old girl, were reported wounded. An unknown number of houses were set afire by incendiary explosives. During one nighttime raid, a tape recording of a bomb attack was played over loudspeakers, set up on the roof of the U.S. Embassy to heighten the anxiety of the capital's residents. When Arbenz went on the air to try and calm the public's fear, the CIA radio team jammed the broadcast. Meanwhile, the agency's army had crossed into Guatemala from Honduras and captured a few towns, but its progress in the face of resistance by the Guatemalan army was unspectacular. On the broadcasts of the CIA's Voice of Liberation, the picture was different. The rebels were everywhere and advancing. They were of large numbers and picking up volunteers as they marched. War and upheaval in all corners, fearsome battles and major defeats for the Guatemalan army. Some of these broadcasts were transmitted over regular public and even military channels, serving to convince some of Arbenz's officers that the reports were genuine. In the same way, the CIA was able to answer real military messages with fake responses. All manner of disinformation was spread and rumors fomented. Dummy parachute drops were made in scattered areas to heighten the belief that a major invasion was taking place. Oh, and then United Fruit Company had to get in on this action too. United Fruit Company's publicity office circulated photographs to journalists of mutilated bodies about to be buried in a mass grave as an example of the atrocities committed by the Arbenz regime. The photos received extensive coverage. Thomas McCann of the company's publicity office later revealed that he had no idea what the photos represented. They could just as easily have been the victims of either side, or of an earthquake. The point is, they were widely accepted for what they were purported to be, victims of communism. In a similar vein, Washington officials reported on political arrests and censorship in Guatemala, without reference to the fact that the government was under siege, let alone who was behind the siege, that suspected plotters and saboteurs were the bulk of those being arrested, or that, overall, the Arbenz administration had a fine record on civil liberties. The performance of the American press in this regard was a little better. The primary purpose of the bombing and the many forms of disinformation was to make it appear that military defenses were crumbling, that resistance was futile, thus provoking confusion and division in the Guatemalan armed forces and causing some elements to turn against Arbenz. The psychological warfare conducted over the radio was directed by E. Howard Hunt, later of Watergate fame, and David Atlee Phillips, a newcomer to the CIA. When Phillips was first approached about the assignment, he asked his superior, Tracy Barnes, in all innocence, "But Arbenz became president in a free election. What right do we have to help someone topple his government and throw him out of office?" For a moment, wrote Phillips later, I detected in his face a flicker of concern, a doubt, the reactions of a sensitive man. But Barnes quickly recovered and repeated the party line about the Soviets establishing an easily expandable beachhead in Central America. Phillips never looked back. When he retired from the CIA in the mid-1970s, he founded the Association of Retired Intelligence Officers, an organization formed to be a sequel to the CIA. An organization formed to counteract the flood of unfavorable publicity sweeping over the agency at the time. American journalists reporting on the events in Guatemala continued to exhibit neither an investigative inclination nor a healthy conspiracy mentality. But what was obscure to the U.S. press was patently obvious to large numbers of Latin Americans. Heated protests against the United States broke out during this week in June in at least 11 countries and was echoed by the governments of Ecuador, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile, which condemned American intervention and aggression. Life magazine noted these protests by observing that world communism was efficiently using the Guatemalan show to strike a blow at the U.S. It scoffed at the idea that Washington was behind the revolt. Newsweek reported that Washington officials interpreted the outcry as an indication of the depth of red penetration into the Americas. Penetration. A State Department memo at the time, however, privately acknowledged that much of the protest emanated from non-communist and even pro-American moderates. On 21st and 22nd June, Guatemalan Foreign Minister Torriello made impassioned appeals to the United Nations for help in resolving the crisis. American UN Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge tried to block the Security Council from discussing a resolution to send an investigating team to Guatemala, characterizing Torriello's appeals as communist maneuvers. But under heavy pressure from UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, the council was convened. Before the vote, while Lodge worked on the smaller nations represented on the council, Eisenhower and Dulles came down hard on France and Great Britain, both of whom favored the resolution. Said the President of the United States to his Secretary of State, "The British expect us to give them a free ride and side with them on Cyprus, and yet they won't even support us on Guatemala. Let's give them a lesson." As matters turned out, the resolution was defeated by 5 votes to 4, with Britain and France abstaining, although their abstentions were not crucial inasmuch as 7 votes were required for passage. Hammarskjöld was so upset with the American machinations, which he believed undercut the strength of the United Nations, that he confided that he might be forced to reconsider my present position in the United Nations. During the same period, the CIA put into practice a plan to create an incident. Agency planes were dispatched to drop several harmless bombs on Honduran territory. The Honduran government then complained to the UN and the Organization of American States, claiming that the country had been attacked by Guatemalan planes. Arbenz finally received an ultimatum from certain army officers: resign or they would come to an agreement with the invaders. The CIA and Ambassador pt2 had been offering payments to officers to defect, and one army commander reportedly accepted $60,000 to surrender his troops. With his back to the wall, Arbenz made an attempt to arm civilian supporters to fight for the government, but array officers blocked the disbursement of weapons. The Guatemalan president knew that the end was near. The Voice of Liberation, meanwhile, was proclaiming that two large and heavily armed columns of invaders were moving toward Guatemala City. As the hours passed, the further advance of the mythical forces was announced, while Castillo Armas and his small band had actually not progressed very far from the Honduran border. The American disinformation and rumor offensive continued in other ways as well, and Arbenz, with no one he could trust to give him accurate information, could no longer be certain that there wasn't at least some truth to the radio bulletins. Nothing would be allowed to threaten the victory so near at hand. The British freighter docked in Guatemala, suspected of having arrived with fuel for Arbenz's military vehicles, was bombed and sunk by a CIA plane after the crew had been warned to flee. It turned out that the ship had come to Guatemala to pick up a cargo of coffee and cotton. A desperate Torriello pleaded repeatedly with Ambassador pt2 to call off the bombings, offering even to reopen negotiations about United Fruit's compensation. In a long cable to John Foster Dulles, the foreign minister described the aerial attacks on the civilian population, expressed his country's defenselessness against the bombings, and appealed to the United States to use its good offices to put an end to them. In what must have been a deeply humiliating task, Torriello stated all of this without a hint that the United States was, or could be, a party to any of it. The pleas were not simply too late. They had always been too late. Asking your abuser to stop abusing you? No. The Castillo Armas forces could not have defeated the much larger Guatemalan... army, that's what it's supposed to be. No. Array? I don't know. Sometimes there's typos from the scan or whatever. The Castillo Armas forces could not have defeated the much larger Guatemalan array, but the air attacks, combined with the belief in the invincibility of the enemy, persuaded Guatemalan military officers to force Arbenz to resign. No communists, domestic or foreign, came to his aid. He asked the head of the officers, Army Chief of Staff Colonel Carlos Diaz, only that he give his word not to negotiate with Castillo Armas, and Diaz, who despised the rebel commander as much as Arbenz did, readily agreed. What Diaz did not realize was that the United States would not be satisfied merely to oust Arbenz. Castillo Armas had been groomed as the new head of government, and that was not negotiable. A CIA official, Eno Habing, who had just arrived in Guatemala to help draft a new constitution for the incoming regime, told Diaz that he had made a big mistake in taking over the government. Colonel, said Habing, you're just not convenient for the requirements of American foreign policy. Presently, pt2 confronted Diaz with the demands that he deal directly with Castillo Armas. At the same time, the ambassador showed the Guatemalan colonel a long list of names of some leaders, requiring that Diaz shoot them all within 24 hours. But why? Diaz asked. Because they're communists, replied pt2. Although Diaz was not a communist sympathizer, he refused both requests, and indicated that the struggle against the invaders would continue. pt2 left, livid with anger. He then sent a simple cable to CIA headquarters in Florida. We have been double-crossed. Bomb! Within hours, a CIA plane took off from Honduras, bombed a military base, and destroyed the government radio station. Colonel Castillo Armas, whose anti-communism the United States could trust, was soon the new leader of Guatemala. The propaganda show was not yet over. At the behest of the CIA, Guatemalan military officers of the new regime took foreign correspondents on a tour of Arbenz's former residence, where they could see for themselves rooms filled with school textbooks published in, yes, the Soviet Union. Oh. The New York Times correspondent Paul Kennedy, considered to be strongly anti-Arbenz, concluded that the books had been planted and did not bother to report the story. Time made no mention of the books either, but somehow came upon the story that mobs had plundered Arbenz's home and found stacks of communist propaganda and 4 bags of earth. Bags of dirt from the communist countries? Okay. 4 bags of earth, 1 each from Russia, China, Siberia, and Mongolia. Debate used to be believable. No, Times article made it clear enough that it now knew of the American role in Arbenz's downfall, although certainly not the full story. But the magazine had nothing to say about the propriety of overthrowing a democratically elected government by force. Casillo Armas celebrated the liberation of Guatemala in various ways. In July alone, thousands were arrested on suspicion of communist activity. Many were tortured or killed. In August, a law was passed, and a committee set up which could declare anyone a communist with no right of appeal. Those so declared could be arbitrarily arrested for up to 6 months, could not own a radio or hold public office. Within 4 months, the committee had registered 72,000 names. A committee official said it was aiming for 200,000. Further implementation of the agrarian reform law was stopped, and all expropriations of land already carried out were declared invalid. United Fruit Company not only received all its land back, but the government banned the banana workers unions as well. Moreover, 7 employees of the company who had been active labor organizers were found mysteriously murdered in Guatemala City. Oh, I'd love to be mysteriously murdered. /J. Hungry Jacks. /Hungry Jack. Dirt collector like Saving Private Ryan. Makes the coffee taste better, you know. Fine exotic dirt. This one has a lot of iron. The new regime also disenfranchised 3/4 of Guatemala's voters by barring illiterates from the electoral rolls and outlawed all political parties, labor confederations, and peasant organizations. To this was added the closing down of opposition newspapers, which Arbenz had not done, and the burning of subversive books, including Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, Dostoevsky novels, and the works of Guatemala's Nobel Prize-winning author Miguel Ángel Asturias, a biting critic of United Fruit. Meanwhile, John Foster Dulles, who was accused by Torriello of seeking to establish a banana curtain in Central America, was concerned that some communists might escape retribution. Who's the prime minister, by the way? Arbenz Torriello? Let me take a look. I think... Was it? Okay, so Torriello and Arbenz were different people. The president, or I guess prime minister, was Jacobo Arbenz, and then let's see. I guess the president and prime minister can be different. I don't know. Let me take a look here. Okay, I guess they were. Yeah, I don't know. Wikipedia says head of state and government of Guatemala, and then Jacobo Arbenz, military officer and former president of Guatemala. Les Miserables is French. Well, it's, you know, yeah. Let's see. John Foster Dulles was concerned that some communists, quote unquote, might escape retribution. In cables he exchanged with Ambassador Perefoy, Dulles insisted that the government arrest those Guatemalans who had taken refuge in foreign embassies and that criminal charges be brought against them to prevent them leaving the country, charges such as having been covert Moscow agents. The Secretary of State argued that communists should be automatically denied the right of asylum because they were connected with an international conspiracy. The only way they should be allowed to leave, he asserted, was if they agreed to be sent to the Soviet Union. But Castillo Armas refused to accede to Dulles' wishes on this particular issue, influenced perhaps by the fact that he, as well as some of his colleagues, had been granted political asylum in an embassy at one time or another. One of those who sought asylum in the Argentine embassy was a 25-year-old Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, who had been living in Guatemala since sometime in 1953, had tried to spark armed resistance to the invading forces, but without any success. Guevara's experience in Guatemala had a profound effect upon his political consciousness. His first wife, Hilda Gadea, whom he met there, later wrote, "Up to that point, he used to say, he was merely a sniper, criticizing from a theoretical point of view the political panorama of our America. From here on, he was convinced that the struggle against the oligarchic system and the main enemy, Yankee imperialism, must be an armed one, supported by the people." In the wake of the coup, the United States confiscated a huge amount of documents from the Guatemalan government, undoubtedly in the hope of finally uncovering the hand of the international communist conspiracy behind our bins. If this is what was indeed discovered, it has not been made public. On 30th June, while the dust was still settling, Dulles summed up the situation in Guatemala in a speech which was a monument to Cold War speak. Oh, it's yeehaw time. "The events in Guatemala exposed the evil purpose of the Kremlin to destroy the inter-American system. Having gained control of what they called the mass organizations, the communists moved on to take over the official press and radio of the Guatemalan government. They dominated the Social Security Organization and ran the Agrarian Reform Program, dictated to the Congress and to the President. Arbenz was openly manipulated by the leaders of communism. The Guatemalan regime enjoyed the full support of Soviet Russia. The situation is being cured by the Guatemalans themselves." When it came to rewriting history, however, Dulles' speech had nothing on these lines from a CIA memo written in August 1954, and only for internal consumption, no less. When the communists were forced by outside pressure to attempt to take over Guatemala completely, they forced Arbenz to resign, deleted. They then proceeded to establish the communist junta under Colonel Carlos Diaz. They believe their propaganda so hard. It's crazy in the CIA. And in October, John Pitafoy sat before a congressional committee and told them, "My role in Guatemala prior to the revolution was strictly that of a diplomatic observer." Yeah, definitely. Excuse me. The revolution that overthrew the Arbenz government was engineered and instigated by those people in Guatemala who rebelled against the policies and ruthless oppression of the communist-controlled government. Later, Dwight Eisenhower was to write about Guatemala in his memoirs. The former president chose not to offer the slightest hint that the United States had anything to do with the planning or instigation of the coup, and indicated that his administration had only the most tangential connections to its execution. When Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs were published in the West, the publisher saw fit to employ a noted criminologist to annotate the work, pointing out errors of omission and commission. Thus it was that the educated, urbane men of the State Department, the CIA and the United Fruit Company, the pipe-smoking, comfortable men of Princeton, Harvard, and Wall Street, assured each other that the illiterate peasants of Guatemala did not deserve the land which had been given to them, that the workers did not need their unions, that hunger and torture were a small price to pay for being rid of the scourge of communism. The terror carried out by Castillo Armas was only the beginning. It was, as we shall see, to get much worse in time. It continued without pause for more than 40 years. In 1955, the New York Times reported from the United Nations that the United States has begun a drive to scuttle a section of the proposed Covenant of Human Rights that poses a threat to its business interests abroad. The offending section dealt with the right of peoples to self-determination and to permanent sovereignty over their natural wealth and resources. Said the newspaper, it declares in effect that any country has the right to nationalize its resources. Okay. Costa Rica, mid 1950s. Trying to topple an ally, part 1. Part 1. If ever the CIA maintained a love-hate relationship, it was with Jose Figueres, 3 times the head of state of Costa Rica. On the one hand, Figueres, I'm probably pronouncing that totally correctly, Figueres, anyway, by his own admission in 1975, worked for the CIA in 20,000 ways all over Latin America for 30 years. I collaborated with the CIA when we were trying to topple Trujillo? He divulged. Speaking of the Dominican Republic dictator. On the other hand, Figueres revealed that the agency had twice tried to kill him. He did not elaborate, although he stated at the same time that he had tried for 2 years to get the Bay of Pigs invasion called off. This may have precipitated one or both of the assassination attempts. The CIA also tried to overthrow the Figueres government. In 1964, the first significant expose of the agency, the Invisible Government, disclosed that in the mid-1950s, CIA agents intruded deeply into the political affairs of Costa Rica, the most stable and democratic republic in Latin America. Knowledgeable Costa Ricans were aware of the CIA's role. The CIA's purpose was to promote the ouster of Jose Pepe Figueres, the moderate socialist who became president in a fair and open election in 1953. Figueres remained in office until 1958. In this, his first term as president, he had headed a liberal junta in the late 1940s. The agency's major grievance was that Figueres had scrupulously recognized the right of asylum in Costa Rica for non-communists and communists alike. The large influx of questionable characters complicated the agency's job of surveillance and forced it to increase its staff. The CIA's problems with Figueres actually went somewhat deeper. Costa Rica was a haven for hundreds of exiles fleeing from various Latin American right-wing dictatorships, such as in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and Figueres was providing groups of them with material and moral support in their plans to overthrow these regimes. To Figueres, this was entirely in keeping with his anti-totalitarian beliefs, directed against the left as well as the right. The problem was that the dictators targeted for overthrow were all members in good standing of the United States' anti-communist Free World Club. The American attitude toward Trujillo was later modified. Moreover, Figueres had on occasion expressed criticism of the American policy of supporting such dictatorships while neglecting the economic and social problems of the hemisphere. These considerations could easily outweigh the fact that Figueres had established his anti-communist credentials, albeit not of the ultra variety, and with no more a socialist than U.S. Senator Hubert Humphrey. Although Figueres spoke out strongly at times against foreign investment, as president, he was eminently accommodating to Central America's betis noirs. Oh, you make me do words. A person or thing that one particularly dislikes. Great Uncle Edward was my father's Betty Noir. As president, he was eminently accommodating to Central America's most disliked thing, the multinational fruit companies. In addition to providing support to Figueres' political opponents, the CIA, reported the Invisible Government, tried to stir up embarrassing trouble within the Communist Party in Costa Rica and to attempt to link Figueres with the communists. An effort to produce evidence that Figueres had been in contact with leading communists during a trip to Mexico was unsuccessful, but CIA agents had better luck with the first part of their strategy, stirring up trouble for the communists. They succeeded in planting a letter in a communist newspaper. The letter, purportedly from a leading Costa Rican communist, put him on record in opposition to the party line on the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. Unaware that the letter was a CIA plant, the leading officials in the American embassy... And then tell the American embassy about that? Okay. The leading officials in the American embassy held an urgent meeting... Oh, okay, no, I guess American-like. the Costa Rican guys in the embassy over there, held an urgent meeting to ponder its meaning. The political officer then dispatched a long classified report to Washington, alerting top policymakers to the possibility of a startling turn in Latin American communist politics. No, it's probably just American. Okay. In 1955, the agency carried out an action against Figueres that was more immediately threatening. A deep personal and political animosity between Figueres and Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza had escalated into violence. An attempt against Somoza's life, launched from Costa Rica with Figueres' support, was countered by an invasion from Nicaragua by land and air. Figueres' biographer, Charles Ameringer, has related that Figueres accused the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency of aiding the Somoza movement against him. He claimed that the CIA felt indebted to Somoza for the help he had given in overthrowing the Arbenz regime. He asserted that the same pilots and planes, the F-47, that had participated in the attack upon Guatemala, afterwards came from Nicaragua and machine-gunned 11 defenseless towns in our territory. According to Figueres, at the same time that the U.S. Department of State arranged the sale of fighter planes for Costa Rica's defense, CIA planes and pilots were flying sorties for the rebels. It is interesting to note that during this period, when virtually nothing had yet been revealed about such blatant CIA covert activities, the fact that the agency had been caught red-handed tapping Figueres' telephone was worthy of condemnatory editorial comment by the Washington Post, and a like statement by Senator Mike Mansfield on the floor of the Senate. Oh, they're going to waggle a finger. They're going to pretend to be mad. Oh, Jose Figueres did not regain the presidency of Costa Rica until 1970, at which time a renewed CIA effort to overthrow him was undertaken for not very different reasons. That was a short one. Well, Syria, 1956, 1957. Purchasing a new government. Oh, damn. This guy's about to declare that neutrality doesn't exist. And then he proceeded to kill everyone. No, neutrality, proclaimed John Foster Dulles in 1956, has increasingly become an obsolete conception, and, except under very exceptional circumstances, it is an immoral and short-sighted conception. Damn, I can't say I have no opinions either way or one way or the other on this anime show. No, the short-sightedness of the neutralist government lay perhaps in its inability to perceive that its neutralism would lead to John Foster Dulles attempting to overthrow it. Syria was not behaving like Washington thought a third world government should. For one thing, it was the only state in the area to refuse all U.S. economic or military assistance. Damascus did not much care for the strings which came attached. The acceptance of military aid usually meant the presence of American military advisors and technicians. Furthermore, the U.S. Mutual Security Act of 1955 specified that the recipient country agreed to make a contribution to the defensive strength of the free world, and declared it U.S. policy to encourage the efforts of other free nations to foster private initiative and competition, i.e. capitalism. Another difficulty posed by Syria was that, although its governments of recent years had been more or less conservative and had refrained from unpleasant leftist habits like nationalizing American-owned companies, U.S. officials, suffering from what might be called anti-communist paranoia, or being victims of their own propaganda, consistently saw the most ominous handwritings on the walls. To appreciate this, one has to read some of the formerly secret, now declassified documents of the National Security Council, NSC, based in part on reports received from the American Embassy in Damascus during 1955 and 1956. Oh, thank you for water.
Death to America!
Oh my god. Wow, Hatsune Miku. Okay. If the popular leftward trend in Syria continues over any considerable period, there's a real danger that Syria will fall completely under left-wing control, either by coup or usurpation of authority. The fundamental anti-US and anti-West orientation of the Syrians is stimulated by inevitable political histrionics about the Palestine problem. 4 successive, short-lived governments in Syria have permitted continuous and increasing communist activities. The communists support the leftist cliques in the army. Apathy towards communism on the part of politicians and army officers is a threat to security. The Arab Socialist Resurrectionist Party, ASRP, AARP? No. And the Communist Party of Syria are capable of bringing about further deterioration of Syrian internal security. Danger of ASRP, coup d'etat, and increased communist penetration of government and army. Of all the Arab states, Syria is at the present time the most wholeheartedly devoted to a neutralist policy with strong anti-Western overtones. If the present trend continues, there is a strong possibility that a communist-dominated Syria will result, threatening the peace and stability of the area and endangering the achievement of our objectives in the Near East. Oh my god, the actual part comes out at the end? Okay. Oh, it's not. We should give priority consideration to developing courses of action in the Near East designed to affect the situation in Syria and to recommending specific steps to combat communist subversion. BRB, 7th coolest non-binary, gonna hang out with friends? Damn, I'm only number 7. I guess I'll, I don't know, made it to top 8. Have a good hangout with friends. It would appear that the idea of military men who were leftist and or apathetic to communists must truly have been an incongruous phenomenon to the American official mind. But nowhere, let's see. But nowhere in any of the documents is there mention of the leftists/communists/ASRP having in fact done anything illegal or wicked, although the language employed is similar to what we saw in the Guatemala chapter. These people don't join anything. They infiltrate. They penetrate. Ooh. Oh my. They control. They're opportunistic. Sorry, I read penetrate and then my brain turned the rest of those words into sexual things. In actuality, the behavior described is like that of other political animals, trying to influence key sectors of the society and win allies. But to the men holding positions of responsibility in the National Security Council and the State Department, the evil intent and danger of such people was so self-evident as not to require articulation. There was one exception, perhaps expressed to explain away an uncomfortable observation. In fact, the Communist Party does not appear to have as its immediate objective seizure of power. Rather, it seeks to destroy national unity, co-strengthen support for Soviet policies and opposition to Western policies, and to exacerbate tensions in the Arab world. It has made significant progress toward these objectives. There is no indication of what the author had in mind by national unity. A leftist-oriented or communist-dominated Syrian government, reasoned the U.S. ambassador to Syria, James Moose Jr., would clearly threaten American interests in neighboring Turkey, which in turn could outflank all the states of the NATO alliance, and so forth and so on. It was clear that since the Syrian government could not be relied upon to do anything about this major impending disaster, something would have to be done about the Syrian government. To this we add the usual Middle Eastern intrigue. In this case, Iraq plotting with the British to topple the governments in both Syria and Nasser's Egypt, the British pressuring the Americans to join the conspiracy, and the CIA compromising, leave Nasser alone, at least for the time being, and we'll do something about Syria. An implausible scenario, scandalous, but in the time-honored tradition of the Middle East. The British were old hands at it. Dulles and the Americans, still exulting in their king-making in Iran, were looking to further remake the oil region in their own image. Wilbur Crane Eveland was a staff member of the National Security Council, the high-level interagency group in Washington, which, in theory, monitors and controls CIA clandestine activities. Because of Eveland's background and experience in the Middle East, the CIA had asked that he be lent to the agency for a series of assignments there. Archibald Roosevelt was, like his cousin Kermit Roosevelt, a highly placed official of the CIA. Both were grandsons of Teddy. Kermit had masterminded the overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953. Archie had fond hopes of doing the same in Syria. Mikhail Bey Ilyan had once served as Syria's foreign minister. In 1956, he was the leader of the Conservative Populist Party. At a meeting of these three men in Damascus, Syria, on 1st of July 1956, as described by Evelyn in his memoirs, Roosevelt asked Ilyan what would be needed to give the Syrian conservatives enough control to purge the communists and their leftist sympathizers. Ilyan responded by ticking off names and places: the radio stations in Damascus and Aleppo, a few key senior officers, and enough money to buy newspapers now in Egypt and Saudi hands. Oh, Kermit, when will you stop airdropping propaganda in East Germany? It's not easy working for the CIA. Crunch. Not easy being green or whatever. Green with envy at the land than oil as communist countries have. Okay. Crunch. Let's see. Roosevelt probed further. Could these things, he asked Ilyan, be done with U.S. money and assets alone, with no other Western or Near Eastern country involved? Without question, Ilyan replied, nodding gravely. On 26th July, Egyptian President... Excuse me. I was able to mute for the second sneeze. Maybe we'll be back later for a third sneeze. On 26th July, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced that his government was taking over the operation of the Suez Canal. The reaction of the British and French was swift and inflamed. The United States was less openly hostile, though it was critical, and Egyptian government funds in the U.S. were frozen. This unexpected incident put a crimp in the sea. This unexpected incident put a crimp in the CIA's plans, for, as Ilyan explains to Evelyn in despair, Nasser was now the hero of the Arab world, in collaboration with any Western power to overthrow an Arab government. Excuse me. In collaboration with any Western power to overthrow an Arab government was politically indefensible. Eventually, the coup was scheduled for 25th October. The logistics, as outlined by Ilyan, called for senior colonels in the Syrian army to take control of Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. The frontier posts with Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon would also be captured in order to seal Syria's borders until the radio stations announced that a new government had taken over under Colonel Kabani, who would place armed units at key positions throughout Damascus. Once control had been established, Ilyan would inform the civilians he'd selected that they were to form a new government, but in order to avoid leaks, none of them would be told until just a week before the coup. For this operation, money would have to change hands. Ilyan asked for and received £500,000 Syrian pounds, approximately $167,000. The Syrian further stipulated that to guarantee their participation, the Syrian plotters would require assurance from the highest level of the American government that the U.S. would both back the coup and immediately grant recognition to the new government. This, Ilyan explained, could be communicated as follows. In April, President Eisenhower had said that the United States would oppose aggression in the Middle East, but not without congressional approval. Could the president repeat this statement in the light of the Suez crisis, he asked, on a specified date when Ilyan's colleagues would be told to expect it? Eisenhower's words would provide the guarantees they were seeking. An affirmative reply to Ilyan's plan arrived in Damascus from Washington the next day. A proper occasion for the requested statement would have to be found, and Secretary Dulles would be the one to use it. The scheme was for Dulles to make public reference to Eisenhower's statement between 16th and 18th October, thus giving Ilyan the week he needed to assemble his civilian team. Before long, John Foster Dulles held a press conference. In light of recent Israeli attacks on Jordan, One of the reporters present asked whether the United States might come to Jordan's aid per our declaration of April 9th. Yes, replied the Secretary of State, repeating the reference to the April statement. The date was 16th October. But following close on the heels of this was a message from Ilian in Damascus to Eveland in Beirut, postponing the date of the coup for 5 days to 30th October because Colonel Tabani had told Ilian that his people weren't quite ready. The postponement was crucial. Early in the morning of the 30th, a very distraught Mikhail Ilian appeared at Evelyn's door. Last night, he cried, the Israelis invaded Egypt and are right now heading for the Suez Canal. How could you have asked us to overthrow our government at the exact moment when Israel started a war with an Arab state? The leftist trend in Syria bell continued to ring in Washington. In January 1957, wrote President Eisenhower later, CIA Director Alan, was it? I'm going to assume that's Alan and not Alien. CIA Director Alan Dulles submitted reports indicating that the new Syrian cabinet was oriented to the left. 2 months later, Dulles prepared a situation report on Syria in which he wrote of an increasing trend toward a decidedly leftist pro-Soviet government. Dulles was concerned with organized leftist officers belonging to the Arab Socialist Resurrection Party. That same month, a State Department internal document stated, the British are believed to favor active stimulation of a change in the present regime in Syria in an effort to assure a pro-Western orientation on the part of future Syrian governments. The United States shares the concern of the British government over the situation in Syria. Then, in June, an internal Department of Defense memorandum spoke of a possible leftist coup. This was to be carried out, according to the memo, against the leftist Syrian government. Thus it was that in Beirut and Damascus, CIA officers were trying their hands again at stage managing a Syrian coup. On this occasion, Kermit Roosevelt, rather than cousin Archibald, was pulling the strings. He arranged for one Howard Rocky Stone to be transferred to Damascus from the Sudan to be sure that the engineering was done by a pro. Stone was, at 32, already a legend in the CIA's clandestine services as the man who had helped Kim Roosevelt overthrow the Iranian government 4 years earlier, though what Stone's precise contribution was has remained obscure. The proposed beneficiary of this particular plot was to be Adib Shishakli, former right-wing dictator of Syria living covertly in Lebanon. Shishakli's former chief of security, Colonel Ibrahim Husseini, now Syrian military attaché in Rome, was secretly slipped into Lebanon under cover of a CIA-fabricated passport. Husseini was then to be smuggled across the Syrian border in the trunk of a U.S. diplomatic car in order to meet with key Syrian CIA agents and provide assurances that Shishakli would come back to rule once Syria's government had been overthrown. But the coup was exposed before it ever got off the ground. Syrian army officers who had been assigned major roles in the operation walked into the office of Syria's... Syrian army officers who had been assigned major roles in the operation walked into the office of Syria's head of intelligence, Colonel Sarraj, turned in their bribe money, and named the CIA officers who had paid them. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Malloy, the American Army attaché, Francis Jeton, a career CIA officer, officially vice consul at the U.S. Embassy, and the legendary Howard Stone, with the title of Second Secretary for Political Affairs, were all declared persona non grata and expelled from the country in August. Colonel Malloy was determined to leave Syria in style. As his car approached the Lebanese border, he rambled some communist nonsense or whatever. Oh, goddamn commies! And then let's get you to bed, Grandpa. As his car approached the Lebanese border, he ran his Syrian motorcycle escort off the road and shouted to the fallen rider that Colonel Sarraj and his commie friends should be told that Malloy would beat the shit out of him with one hand tied behind his back if they ever crossed his path again. All right, let's get you to bed, Grandpa. Sorry. Sounds like my 7th grade social studies teacher. The Syrian government announcement, which accompanied the expulsion order, stated that Stone had first made contact with the outlawed Social Nationalist Party and then with the army officers. When the officers reported the plot, they were told to continue their contacts with the Americans and later met Shishakli and Husseini at the homes of U.S. Embassy staff members. Husseini reportedly told the officers that the United States was prepared to give a new Syrian government between $300 and $400 million in aid if the government would make peace with Israel. An amusing aside to the affair occurred when the Syrian defense minister and the Assyrian ambassador to Italy disputed the claim that Husseini had anything to do with the plot. The ambassador pointed out that Husseini had not been in Syria since 20th July, and his passport showed no indication that he had been out of Italy since that time. The State Department categorized the Syrian charge as complete fabrications and retaliated by expelling the Syrian ambassador and a second secretary and recalling the American ambassador from Syria. Good, we didn't want him. No, it marked the first time since 1915 that the United States had expelled the chief of mission of a foreign country. In the wake of the controversy, the New York Times reported that there are numerous theories about why the Syrians struck at the United States. One is that they act at the instigation of the Soviet Union. Another is that the government manufactured an anti-U.S. spy story to distract public attention from the significance of Syria's negotiations with Moscow. Oh, fanfic. /J. No, nothing wrong with fanfic. No, we're making okay. In the same issue, a Times editorial speculated upon other plausible sounding explanations. Neither in its news report nor in its editorial did the New York Times seem to consider even the possibility that the Syrian accusation might be true. President Eisenhower, recalling the incident in his memoirs, offered no denial to the accusation. His sole comment on the expulsions was, "The entire action was shrouded in mystery, but the suspicion was strong that the communists had taken control of the government. Moreover, we had fresh reports that arms were being sent into Syria from the Soviet bloc." Syria's neutralism/leftism continued to obsess the United States. 5 years later, when John F. Kennedy was in the White House, he met with British Prime Minister Macmillan, and the two leaders agreed, according to a CIA report, on penetration and penetration and penetration and penetration. Agreed according to a CIA report on penetration and cultivation of disruptive elements in the Syrian armed forces, particularly in the Syrian army, so that Syria can be guided by the West. Decades later, Washington was still worried, though Syria had still not gone communist. My nose is dripping a little. That's really fucked up. You may think to yourself. Herm. I don't want to drag this out across like 12 different readings or something. Oh, let's see how many would it be. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 times. I don't know. Maybe like 10 readings in total. If I keep it at this rate of like 3 hours of a thing and then stopping. I'm gonna have to blow my nose. Yeah, no, I guess as long as I just do more streams of reading this book, it won't take as long. Usually, in a sort of way. Yeah. I'm gonna blow my nose off stream. You guys don't get to hear me blow my nose. Okay, I'm gonna raid out into some guys, some critters. They're playing Dead Space 3. I think it's a co-op game, actually. Really messed up. So that means they're both playing it. But yeah. Let's see, we're on page 88. Which ones do we cover? Albania, Eastern Europe, Germany, Iran, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Syria. Thank you for stream. Thank you for watching TMTN. Yeah. Never. Mario probably would have gotten back in a little bit anyway, so it's probably a good time to stop. Gonna have to wake up earlier. I can read more. But yeah, have a good day or night or evening or whatever, y'all. Don't forget to drink water and brush your teeth and take your pills and vitamins. And if someone asks if you're a communist, dodge the question and just say that you care about the people, common man, or whatever. All right, bye bye. Have a good night. Have fun with Laz and Zam. They're gaming it up. Xbox 360 era gaming. So messed up. Seriously, it chose this time to fucking lag the fuck out? You gotta be kidding me.